What do you mean? Guy, I'm literally hopping onto this because it's like, oh,
that's what you said.
Channel?
You said I don't understand
no,
what it is that she believes.
I don't know.
And so I wanted to know. And so I said,
is it simply that God gives you the objective truths, or is it God gives you the objective truths and then you interpret them in a relative way?
Okay, so I'm gonna say some simple stuff that's gonna be probably not very satisfying, and then you can ask me more about it.
Determines what is good and what is bad, but what is that part about, like, you don't know what God is saying specifically?
The issue is that sometimes it's hard to discern what specifically that means.
This isn't exactly something I should get into, or because I don't want this to turn to like a 2-hour discussion about the heart of whatever, but OnlyFans and is basically doing not just OnlyFans, but just basically doing stuff and is a star, right? So for a star example, to you, is that morally good or is that morally bad?
Okay, so these are two separate hypotheticals that have nothing to do with each other. Just to be clear.
all of that is incoherent. Yeah, like,
do you think that like God is solved?
Any of those things. How do you
Do you think that God is solved? Do you think that God is like solved?
I think the only person that could. What do you mean solve?
do you believe in the Trinity? Do you like God
It's not
is?
pedantic, it's just common
Yes,
sense.
you're just saying that the question doesn't make sense because you're refusing the semantics that everyone else is willing to use.
And it's even in the Bible.
So you're
by the way.
rejecting the definition,
It's
which by definition is
not
semantic.
terminating
Unless you disagree with the
apologetics.
definition is semantic.
It is
Okay.
literally semantic. It is
Wait, it's
literally
not like
semantic.
no. It's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean.
Okay, that's what
sorry,
I was like.
no.
I don't know. I'm gonna dip then, guys.
I would not use this language.
All right,
Thanks,
bye.
Kyle.
I did think so. I was like, you've lost me already. Okay.
Rob is fun to debate because
Thank God,
he's
we can
good at
actually talk
arguing,
now.
but he has he gish gallops like no other. Like he just runs and runs and runs and runs and runs, and then by the time he stops, you've got 50 things that you got to address, and when you
Yeah, but
finish
you gotta
addressing
write down all
one,
50
he's
things.
gonna run with 50
You know what?
more. So
Yeah, but you know what pisses him off? If you write down all 50 things and you address them one by one, that pisses him off. So you don't let him run. You just gotta keep bringing him back. All right, that's what you do.
Rezzy, you said you had questions for NotSoErudite, so I'll let you ask your questions first about the.
What do you mean? Guy, I'm literally hopping onto this because it's like, oh,
That's what you
religion
said.
channel?
You said I don't understand
No,
what it
I
is
just
that
don't
she
know.
believes.
I don't know.
And so I wanted
Yeah.
to know. And so I said that you could ask the questions first. But if you don't want to ask your freaking questions, then
Do
that's
you want
fine.
me to like?
Nobody's-
Do you have questions you want to ask, and you want me to like kind
I
of
have
guide
a million
this? Or what's
questions.
up?
I have a million questions. But if
Okay.
you want, you said that you didn't know what it was that you believed
I just-
on a
yeah,
couple
I
of
just wanna
specific
get,
things.
like, a
so if you
basic
wanted to ask those
understanding.
questions, that's fine. You can ask those questions.
cool.
But if you don't want to,
Cool.
if you want to leave, you can go home.
I'm already home, but sure, absolutely. Hi, Erudite. I came on here to it's just Tom's Tuesday panel. Had some free time, decided to pop on. Didn't realize that we were going to be talking about religion through this lens of, I believe, your
Hold on.
statements on free will.
KidNotKin, do you have a camera, sir? Are
What?
you?
I was just
Oh,
watching
you're on
your
a phone.
video.
Never mind.
I'm on a phone. Yeah. Wait, you're watching my video?
Yeah, I was starting to watch your video on FD Signifier, and then I was like, I should probably hop on Tom's show, and why not?
Oh, cool.
Hmm.
Nice.
What was the video on?
It's like the FD Signifier one. He posted it like 15 hours
Oh,
ago.
yes. I saw
FD
that.
Signifier criticizes Shuanhead's attempt at saving men.
So I wanted to ask, okay, so I saw you on the panel with, what's it called? BPF.
Yeah, and
Okay.
them. Yeah.
Sort of.
Yes. Okay. So, because I was talking to Sprouticus about this earlier as well. You said that, because I just recently left religion, just within the last like 6 months, I stopped calling myself a Christian. But to me, like, because God says this is the way it is, and like this is what is right or wrong, it seems objectively that entails an objective morality as well, and that even just not being a Christian in and of itself would be a sin, and therefore, like, you're not doing the right thing. But I thought you were saying that that people are only judged based on the morality that they or that they believe in, and that people are only doing something immoral based on their own ethical system.
Not quite. That's moral subjectivism. I don't believe in moral subjectivism. I'm a moral relativist. Like really simply, I'm a moral relativist.
Can you
as a
explain
Christian.
that?
What moral relativism is specifically?
Yeah, I don't
or-
quite know what that means. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So basically, there's different types of relativism. So one would be like individual. That's more close to like subjectivism. I'd be more of like a cultural relativist. So basically, I judge what is like moral or immoral based on some level of context. So it's all like relative essentially. So the context that I tend to look at would be like the culture and the time and like the scientific and philosophical knowledge available at the time of like a moral decision being made. So like if
Do you
I'm
have,
talking about the morality of a North
So if I
American
may,
person-
right. So in the past, if people's lifespans were shorter, you can justify, for example, you can arguably justify procreating at a younger age than 18 for because of like moral relativism, right?
I suppose. I mean, you could use multiple moral
Like
systems
that
probably to make that argument.
yeah, right. But you would be using something like moral relativism as like a concept with your moral framework to justify something like that, right?
Yeah, I guess like if it's required, there'd be like a lot of context I would need before I would answer that, and there's probably like an age cap that I think we would all agree. And it's a
Okay,
science
I've
that we
heard,
need to
yeah, I've
follow.
heard that argument before from a Taliban sympathizer. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
what
it could
I
be
heard that from
relativism
before.
could be used to justify that. Yeah,
That means that
sure,
like
yeah.
slavers back when slavery was legal and a social norm, that they weren't necessarily doing anything moral because that was relative to the time that they were in. Yeah.
Well, it depends. It depends. So my moral system is going to be based kind of like I would test people on 4 things. So that person's beliefs, that person's belief system, the beliefs, the like standards of the society that they exist within, and then I would compare it to like my society standards if I'm dissatisfied with that. So the slave owner could be morally neutral or could be immoral depending on all of those things. It would really depend.
Would you
Like, was it
would you
reasonable for them to
distinguish
think it's
this?
okay?
Would you distinguish this from a sort of a non-cognitivist position, where that there is no objective moral fact whatsoever?
Yeah.
That really
Yeah,
you're just
because-
abiding by the cultural standards of what is the classic, the murder boo? Like just like when you're saying something is wrong, you're basically just saying that you don't like that thing.
Right.
Well, most
so
people
like
don't think about it. Yeah.
relative is more oppositional to absolutism than it is to something like objectivism, right? So like the opposite to objective is subjective, whereas the opposite to absolute is relative. So relative is just varying the circumstances. You can use relativism to basically vary it to the point where like you can be like a non-cognitivist, like you said, but I'm not a non-cognitivist personally.
Okay, because I feel like the distinction there would be like, if you're a moral relativist, then you can say like for a fact that like in this particular context, this particular thing is good or bad, based on the culture and the environment around them. It is objectively good or bad to that context.
Right. So like relativism can be a moral realist or a moral anti-realist, right? Because moral relativism is a
Sure.
massive, massive branch of thinking about.
So
moral.
I'm just a little bit curious, right? So what is the difference between relativist and like subjectivist, right? Like because when you're talking about like these two concepts, like what is one specific example in our society right now where it would be allowed under one but not allowed under the other, or something like that, like under your framework? I'm just curious, like an actual real world example.
Sure. I want to make sure I'm understanding your question first, though. Just because like these words have sometimes really specific meanings, but I think when most people talk about it, they're probably not using the precise like philosophical, which is not like a condemnation by any means.
Sure.
I think the first issue I ran into is that I wasn't being super precise about my language, so that's the main reason I'm being super.
So relativist is depending on scenario, time, and culture, right?
It can be multiple. So a relativist just basically is the view that moral judgments are true or false only relative to some particular standpoint.
Oh, okay. Some subjective standpoint, you said?
Some relative. And
Relative
it's only
standpoint.
relative to some particular standpoint.
Okay. And how would you define a moral subjectivist?
Oh man. I guess let me pull that one up. I don't have that one on.
It's going to be subjective to the individual at hand. Like there is no actual
Usually,
like
yeah.
moral truth to be found. It's just going to be based on what the individual person thinks is good or bad. So like not within the context of the culture or the
It's decided by the individual. Yeah.
community that they're in. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And
Is
I'm like
that-
a
I thought
moral
it's-
realist brand of relativist.
Yeah, I'm very much the moral anti-realist, non-cognitivist position.
Right. Yeah. That's what you and I, when we were both really drunk at TwitchCon, were talking about.
Oh my God! Don't even remind me. I barely even remember. Okay, that's embarrassing.
You were being like, yeah, but everything's subjective. And I was like, nah, man, there's some things that are real. And we were having like a very
Listen,
meta-ethical
If
talk
I
about
wasn't
moral
drunk,
subjectivism.
okay, if I wasn't drunk, you would have been in trouble.
I would have. I probably would have, especially back then, because I was just like, I'm still a little fledgling in philosophy, so I would have been.
So not so
steamrolled, I'm
erudite.
Sure. Yeah.
Why is it that you don't prescribe yourself to moral subjectivist but to relativist?
Because I believe in like a moral reality. I think that there are things that are like true, basically.
Do you
Like
believe
there are rights
that
and wrongs, concretely,
Oh.
and can be like
concretely?
yeah.
What is a right and a wrong concrete in your opinion?
So like what I mean by concretely means like given all of the information, there
Okay.
can be known to some degree a right and a wrong concretely. And this is
Right.
Yeah.
because specifically I'm religious, right? If I wasn't
Okay.
religious, I think it would be really hard to have this standpoint.
Right, but you said concretely, right? Like
Because I think God
it's
knows
set
exactly what
in.
is right and wrong at all times. The problem is that doesn't mean I know what God thinks is right and wrong. They're not always accessible.
But the confusion that I would have
Wait.
is why God would have a distinction between your location and culture, as to what is right and wrong for you.
So I'm going to give you the lame answer, which is the tautology, which is because
Oh,
God
no.
says so. Yeah, because God says so.
Yeah.
I can do whatever he
Yeah.
wants, right? But that's the axiom, right? That's the tautology. That is because
Yeah.
that is biblically, though. I can give you biblical reasons. It's also baked into Christianity. It is like inherent. In fact, Protestants are weird. Protestants are the only ones that have like this really dogmatic view of ethics, whereas like Catholics
Right.
and Eastern Orthodox are not like this.
Yeah, I mean, because like ultimately the problem that Christians would end up facing is that why is it that if it was the case that like you basically had to subscribe to the particular like branch of Christian morality to be seen as a moral subject whatsoever, then the question then would be why is God biased to people of particular areas? That why is it that the Europeans are significantly more morally valuable than like anyone in Asia, basically?
I guess the framing is something that I maybe would disagree with about moral value necessarily. What I would talk about, at least what we're talking about here, would be like people have had the issue where I say like this might be a rule for me, but not for thee, right? As a religious person, the lane of the plug issue. That was where like a lot of this stemmed from. And so
Mm.
the issue is that what is sin biblically seems to be a lot more connected to what you know, right? So this is why, for example, when like the Jews are killing in the story where the Jews are killing Jesus, right? Like arguably like one of the worst sins, like they're literally killing God. That's kind of bad. He says, "Forgive them, God, they don't know what they do," which is a pretty major shift of like understanding about like knowledge, especially because you have to understand with Jesus, we've got this new covenant that's coming in specifically. Another example is going to be coming from like Matthew 19:8, for example, where they're basically the Pharisees are trying to like trick him and they're having this. I won't get into all the context because there's a lot kind of culturally and historically going on, but they're talking about divorce. And they basically ask them, can you divorce? The Pharisees asked Jesus, can you divorce your wife? And Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. This was not the way from the beginning. Essentially saying, before it was okay because of the context that you're in, but now we're saying it's not okay. So like if you go through the Bible, there is I mean, we could talk about the Bible in and of itself because, like, I'm not sola scriptura. That's another issue that people are going to run into with me. I'm not sola scriptura.
That's
Wait.
what I was waiting to ask
No,
you
there's
about,
also-
because
you can also ask-
obviously you're not sola scriptura, but I don't understand, like, because I did grow up Protestant, so I'm wondering why. Because for me, why would we get the Bible if this is supposed to be like our message from God to like explain to us so that we all understand these things? Why wouldn't we take that literally and and have that as the message, when like even Jesus was fairly clear that like the church and church leaders can be corrupt and can, you know, use religion in a blasphemous way. Like, why wouldn't we have why wouldn't we have the text to know when that is or isn't happening?
So I would answer this in two ways. Number one, the writers didn't intend it literally, especially the Old Testament. When you read the Old Testament and you apply a sola scriptura fundamentalist lens to it, you're inherently reading it incorrectly. This is why Catholics and Eastern Orthodox considers like sola scriptura as like the fundamental heresy of heresies for Protestants. I think all heresies of Protestantism comes from sola scriptura. It's really, really interesting to read. There's an Orthodox scholar, I can't remember his name right now, but he writes a bunch about the heresy of heresies that Protestants have. Again,
Wait, sorry.
here's another
What's the justification for assuming that the writer's intent was to be subjective?
Okay, because of all of our understandings about how writings occurred in Eastern historical tradition. Because it's especially the Old Testament, it's an Eastern book. It's an Eastern history book. And so when we look at the way that Eastern history was written, they were always mythological in nature, right? They would tell stories that somewhat mapped onto the people's history, but the stories were more important for imparting meaning to the people that were hearing it than they were important about like being didactic. So like most ancient Eastern writings, when we read them, we can pull little bits about the culture out from it, but like nobody reads like tons of like writings that we would call like fiction and go like, yeah, literally Achilles was like dipped by the gods and stuff like that. But we can learn things like arete and like what arete meant to the Greeks and how that's embodied in Achilles. And we can also learn about like lots of the material that they're talking about, like the weaponry and stuff like that is pretty actually accurate historically, but it's not didactic history. And most of Eastern writings are mythological history. That's how they used to write history.
So, like, how would you? So, I find this really, really interesting. I've recently been really interested in Kierkegaard, just because I'm very Nietzschean, and Kierkegaard basically takes like the other alternative of like Nietzsche is basically like since Darwin, we basically have to just give up all of the like moral understandings that we have and where our values come from, and then Kierkegaard takes the other position of like, listen, there's no objective way to say which choice you take between abandoning all of that and living like an aesthetic life versus living a life of absolute faith and in the text of the Bible. And I find this really, really interesting. But if you're talking about the way that the Bible was written with this like mythological like bent to it, how is it that like we can assume that like the mythological bent to it didn't have its own purpose in regards to like the Nietzschean understanding of the situation would be that like the Christians had to invent their own god to have salvation from their like servitude, but that was something that was like historically and culturally significant of like they had to create their own values in this situation. So in a historical standpoint where you have like a people that have like a necessity of creating their own values, how can we just assume that like as this happens there's some sort of like a rational justification that links back to an understanding of God?
Is the question simply, and sorry if this is super reductive, I just want to make sure I'm understanding you.
Yeah, no,
is the
that's fine.
question simply, if you're saying that the book, specifically when I'm saying mythological, I'm saying the Old Testament specifically. The New Testament is actually more Western writings, and we can talk about why I'm not sola scriptura with the New Testament as well.
I just want to be clear real quick, just so that there's no confusion. So earlier we started talking about the religious and like objective morality and stuff, and I said I wanted everybody to hold off for a little bit because I was like, I do want to ask NotSoErudite about a bunch of this stuff, but if the topic's worn out by then, and then we go back to it after moving on to another topic, I was like, I don't want to do that. So I don't want other people to think like I meant for this to be like, you know, you guys aren't allowed to have positions and like it's an argument with just NotSoErudite or something.
We're just interviewing NotSoErudite.
Yes, and that's fine. Like if everybody's cool with that, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that like you guys understood that I just wanted to like wait for her to have the argument.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I just want
No, but you're cool. You're cool. Do your thing. It's all good one way or the other.
So from
Wait,
my,
wait.
I just want to say real quick.
Wait.
There's a
Eric,
question
okay,
posed.
you
She has a
guys
question
interrupted
posed.
Erudite. I was
She has a
waiting
question
patiently for an
posed.
answer.
Sure, yeah, but I go afterwards. No.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't waiting.
Sorry, Kyla, go ahead.
Wait, what?
Kid,
There's
what
a
was the
lineup.
question? Sus, Kid, what
Spartacus
was
is
the
saying
question you asked?
Well, Kyla was in the middle of answering
I
a
was
question when I
clarifying.
interrupted,
Yeah, I
and
was
so yeah, I
clarifying
wanted
his
to let her
question.
finish.
I was just basically saying, is your question basically, if you're saying this is mythologized, couldn't your God just be like mythologized bullshit? Is that basically what you're saying? Like, why do you believe in the spaghetti
Yeah, I'm
monster
saying
in the
like, what's the
sky?
justification of knowing where that mythology starts and stops?
Yes. So the issue is that both of these things can be true because the problem with the spaghetti monster in the sky is it's necessarily unfalsifiable. This is the big problem, right? This is why it's a leap of faith. This is why when people are like, I
Yep.
think it's ridiculous. I'm like, okay, there's
Yeah,
okay.
I mean that's why
right?
I was saying that I think Kierkegaard is really interesting in this discussion because of that necessity of
Right.
having that leap of faith. But I'm questioning whether or not like you think that like that leap of faith is absolutely justified given the historical context.
So the issue is that my leap of faith is going to be like this deeply personal thing where basically like I talked to Wicked Supreme about this a while ago and he was like, I just feel like you're a smart person. There's no reason you should be a Christian.
Wait.
And I was like, fair enough. Hold on. And basically what I said is when it comes to me and my personal faith, I've had too many things that keep happening in my faith in relation to like my spiritual experience with God that it doesn't seem reasonable to not believe in God. And like, this is why when people are like, well, I've had these experiences and that's why I don't believe in God. I'm like, that's super fair. This is like the unfalsifiable personal stuff. And so the issue is that because it's the unfalsifiable, I can have an answer for you that won't be satisfying, which would basically say it can be true that early Christians and Jewish people were making up facts and ideas and theology to justify what they needed to do, and that Yahweh was real and working through them and helping them, like what they needed to do was
Right.
somewhat
Okay, can I go?
divine by him, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait,
Sure.
before
Yeah.
you go, please. Okay. Okay,
good?
finally. Okay, all right. So
You good?
I'm good. So I just have a question because I sort of want to steer away from all of this like Eastern Bible quotes and stuff like that because I don't really have all this funnel. When I was invited onto this panel, I didn't even know what the subject was, so I'm sort of trying to improvise right now, right? But my kind of I'm still trying to understand what your position is on like this thing, and I still can't quite figure out what the difference between your difference, at least between moral relativism and moral subjectivity. And I want you to be able to explain it in a way without quoting like this kind of history behind it or without this kind of whatever. And I think I asked you earlier for an example in real life where you would apply it in different ways between these two, where I can see the difference between these two without referring to like the scripture or whatever like that, right? But yeah, I was just curious about that. But the second part is that if now going back into the scripture just slightly, right? You know, from a commoner's perspective, right? Who's agnostic, doesn't believe in God, right? Whatever. What does God exactly tell you then? Because I would say like a lot of people would say, oh, God tells me the objective morals of the truths of the world. But if God doesn't tell you the objective truths because you're not like a moral objectivist, right? Or maybe God tells you some degree of objective truths, but you interpret them in a relative way, but I still don't quite understand that exact point. So I was wondering if you can answer these two questions.
Okay. So I just want to make sure that because this is complicated. So there's outline for me again simply what the two questions are. You want an example of basically like
Right.
my rules for thee and not for thee. And your second question, I just don't think I caught it.
Oh, the second question is what does God tell you? Is it simply that God gives you the objective truths, or is it God gives you the objective truths and then you interpret them in a relative way?
Okay, so I'm going to say some simple stuff that's going to be probably not very satisfying, and then you can ask me more about it. Does that work?
No, that's the most satisfying, but go ahead, yeah.
Okay.
Because I like brevity.
I'm going to start with the second one first, if that's okay with you, and then go back to the
Okay,
first one.
sure.
Okay. So I'm a divine command theorist, but I function as a relativist because relativism is baked into God's divine command. So relativism to me is part of God's mandate for me. So I'm a divine command theorist in that I believe that basically whatever God says is, right? So if God says this is good, it is good.
Okay.
Fundamentally. The issue is that I don't always know what God is saying, and I could be wrong. So I function as a relativist because God expressly tells us to do this.
Wait. So God tells you what is good and what is bad, but then you don't know what God is saying. Did I get that correctly?
So God determines what is good and what is bad.
Okay. So God determines what is good and what is bad, but what is that part about? Like you don't know what God is saying specifically.
So the
Like, can
issue is
you?
that sometimes it's hard to discern what specifically that means, right? Because I don't have like I joke about like having a single line up to God, but I can't just like be like boop boop boop. Hey God, like is when Lane Under the Plug does porn, is she committing a sin as a non-Christian? I
So
can't
so so
actually
how
do
do
that.
you so my question to you then is this: how do you discern that then, right? Like how do you
Mhm.
discern what is good and what is wrong, and how do I know that you aren't twisting some morals to your advantage or to like to others disadvantages, like to justify some things that are, weird or whatever, right?
Yeah, is
Like
there like
how
a
do you determine that to
consistency?
your,
Is there a consistency that you see
or is
with
it
like
just
what God
convenient to
is telling
you?
you that you're saying like I see it seems like God is saying things are good based on this specific system, and so I think that that's the system that he wants us to use, or are you like picking and choosing
Or are you
when
just
you think
100% disingenuous and it's just convenient, evidently?
Okay. There's a lot of
what
loading in there. So the issue is we're basically asking about sin, right? As a divine command theorist. That's what we're asking about.
Okay.
And I'm going to say some stuff that sounds very judgmental, but I'm not meaning it this way. This is just like the reality. In
Sure, no
regards to
problem. I don't believe in gay
non-Christians,
marriage either. Yeah.
that's not what I was going to say. In
I'm
regards
kidding.
to
I'm kidding
non,
on that. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
so I don't really care about the sins of non-Christians because it's pretty irrelevant because biblically they're considered like dead, right? So like me being like, oh no, is Lena the Plug doing sin? It's like she's not a Christian. Who fucking cares? As far as Christian morality goes, it's not even important.
Mm,
It's such an
okay.
unimportant question. So it's like, could I hypothetically try to do it? Sure. I'd need to like reason it out. And it's like hard to know because I think sin is very much about like knowledge. And so it's like, well, if Lena the Plug has any reason based on like her circumstances and anything to believe that maybe what she's doing is wrong, it might be a sin. And if she was a Christian, it definitely might be a sin. But also like she's not a Christian, so I don't know, right? So it's like it's this like practice that I'm being asked to do that to me is like deeply meaningless. Knowing whether
Sorry,
a
when you say that
non-Christian,
because she's when you say that because she's not a Christian, she's like are you saying that she's like outside of the moral framework because she's you like basically it's a zero sum game. If you're not Christian, then you're like going to hell. Is it that kind of thing, or is it just that
it's
like she's outside of
immaterial.
the type of framework?
It's immaterial. Yeah, because until like basically
Okay,
in like
that's
Christian theology, right? We believe in like heart regeneration. Basically, until a heart is regenerated, worrying about their sin is kind of meaningless because heart regeneration is the beginning. That's like salvation, right? That's the most important fundamental step of where conversations about sin even begin. After that, it's like you're just like it's just like empty worrying and condemning. And so I can still determine morality of non-Christians, but I'm not going to use it on like whether I think what they're doing is sin specifically.
so what about Sprouticus? Like do you think that morals are just coming from what the Bible is telling you, or do you think that it's something that like are you finding some sort of system that you're supposed to abide by?
I go by I was hoping that she would still be here, but I go by the conviction of the Holy Spirit. So
She got her
I think
headphones
that
on.
I think the Holy Spirit will
She can
convict.
hear. She
Okay,
can hear.
so yeah, I think the Holy Spirit will convict me if I'm doing something wrong, and that is where I'll take my correction from.
Yeah,
And of course
divine revelation.
that can come from people and stuff like that. But I was gonna ask. I was gonna ask. Wouldn't it somewhat be easier just to kind of like utilize what Paul said when it came to talking about Christians and whether or not they should eat of the meat that was sold by pagans to pagan gods, and
Romans
basically
14.
saying that if you are if you are convicted by it, not to do it, but if you're not convicted by it, there's not really an issue with it, but don't do it in front of someone who's convicted by it in order not to make your brother stumble.
Yeah, exactly. And that is what you're describing there is the fundamental moral relativist position that I believe God imparts on Christians. This is why essentially what he's saying is worrying about whether or not a non-Christian is doing sin isn't super important because sin is very much about like the knowledge that you have, and until a heart is regenerated they don't have like the Holy Spirit conviction to be telling them that they're doing sin. So I can still weigh in, again, as a relativist, about whether I think what they're doing is immoral based on their own personal beliefs and all sorts of stuff.
Wait,
in a
wait,
way that
what's this
most
about the
people do.
heart? I'm a bit confused about the heart part. Like, can you?
Okay, this is like a big theological thing.
Is this more of a faith thing that like if I don't have the faith, then this isn't exactly something I should get into, or because I don't want this to turn to like a 2-hour discussion about the heart of whatever, but you know.
So just think of like it's a theological concept, the gospel of regeneration. I'm trying to think of like a really simple way to explain it. If Sprouticus, if you have any way to explain it simply, because I think you believe in a heart gospel of regeneration.
Somebody
as
said
well.
intuition
Yes, I do.
/ instinct in the chat. Is that what a heart is?
No,
So-
no.
No?
No.
This is like a very specific theological thing about salvation. So basically, fuck, I'm trying to think about how to
The
explain this
soul?
simply. Yeah, sure.
So-
The soul.
The heart is basically it's your very kind of like intuition. So back when these words were written down, there was the heart and the mind. So the mind was kind of like what was intellectual, whereas the heart was more so emotional. So like if you felt emotions, it came from the heart. If it was more so intellectual, it came from the mind. So that's you have to kind of take that into consideration when you're looking at things when talk about the difference between the heart and the mind.
Well, so once you're
Okay.
saved, you're like the idea is that once you're saved and once you've like been born again, that you have like an inner voice that kind of tells you what to do and like what is
You're
right
no
and
longer
wrong,
just
and
based
you're
on the
being led
emotions of
and
your flesh and blood.
right. It's
And you're
kind
saying
of-
what your heart tells you is right or wrong, or like how does this relate to the moral
It
part again?
depends if you're saved or not. It
The
depends if it's
gospel of
regenerated.
regeneration is about basically whether or not like your soul, your spirit, or whatever is alive and existent, which God has to do to reach you. And if that exists, then all of a sudden sin becomes relevant, because before then, it doesn't mean that non-Christians can't do sin. They can. The issue is that it's really unimportant. And one of the biggest things pushed on Christians by Jesus is to not worry a bunch, particularly about non-Christians' sin. It's extremely non-consequential
Sure,
in your
sure.
faith.
Okay,
because
so
the heart of
I have a
regeneration hasn't occurred before.
yeah,
sure, I have a hypothetical for you, Erudite.
It's like
Yeah, so for example, right, let's just say we have 2 Christians, okay, and one Christian is a thief and steals and this person steals a bag of chips because he wants to feed, you know, his little brother because his little brother is about to starve to death, right? And this is situation 1. Now situation 2 is this Christian is doing OnlyFans and is basically doing not just OnlyFans, but just basically doing Pornhub stuff and is a porn star, right? So for a porn star example, to you, is that morally good or is that morally bad?
Okay, so these are 2 separate hypotheticals that have nothing to do with each other,
Right.
just to be clear.
Right, they have nothing to do with each other, but I just want to gauge your opinions on these 2 different scenarios.
Okay, so and the one, so you want to know, okay, sorry. So in one, you want to know about whether a Christian doing OnlyFans and is a porn star, if they're in sin.
Yeah.
Okay, what do
Wait,
they
in sin
do about it?
is in sin and morally bad consistent in your mind?
No, not always.
No.
Because not everything that I would
Oh.
say, yeah, because not everything that we would agree like culturally is immoral. Like censorship is probably immoral. I don't think it's a sin.
yeah, but that's kind of going well. So
Yeah, but even like within your construct, you just bring up the Magdalene, and it's like, yeah, there's no knowledge there. That's effectively what you're saying, right?
Just because
Like the idea
something
of
may be
Magdalene.
bad to do doesn't mean it rises to the level of sin.
You're saying
Right,
that
'cause
if there's
sin is
some sort of
specific
bad
things.
outcome, whereas like a sin is like against God, whereas like a negative outcome is more of like a
No, you can sin
utilitarian
against a
thing.
person. You can sin against your brother.
It's against the
Sin is
flesh.
basically when you do something that like you know is wrong and is wrong and also offends God. Right? So like taking the Lord's name in vain would be like
So the
probably a
difference
sin.
is that it offends God?
No, there's 2 qualifiers that I gave there.
So the first one is that it offends God, and the second one is
Sin is something that you know is wrong and you do it anyways. Or it offends God.
you know it's wrong and you do it anyway. So you know, according to your moral relativism, that it is wrong and you do it anyway.
Right.
Correct.
I mean,
So
there's
say the
also like
Christian-
sinning
Yeah,
of
by
the
the
heart
moral
as
system.
well, but
Yeah, but
So
it's
I
by
think
the moral
there's-
system that you set up is how you determine if it's wrong. And if you go
Right.
against the moral system, you're going against yourself. That comes to mortal sin.
I am so
which
confused.
becomes-
I'm sorry.
Okay,
It's
so,
like a
here's a
personalized
hypothetical. Here's a
relationship.
hypothetical.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep up, but yeah.
I'm going to give you guys a
for sure.
hypothetical, all right? Because this question has been answered by tons of theologians. Okay, if somebody does something that they believe is wrong and they do it anyways, but it turns out God doesn't think it's wrong, did they commit a sin?
Yes,
Yes.
they went against their own conviction.
And this is like I don't think I've met a Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or Christian that disagrees with this. If you believe what you're doing is wrong, even if it literally isn't, it is now a sin because you're doing something that you believe to be wrong and you're doing it anyways.
So
in the case of the Christian doing porn, there's a lot of reasons why I would be like, it's probably not a good idea. The issue is, what do they think about it? Have they prayed about it? Are they being honest with themselves? Are they being honest with God? There's all these complex questions that, again, if I was going to condemn it as sin, which I'm inclined to do so because I think so, there's a number of reasons. However, I would need to look into it because I haven't looked a ton into like prostitution, biblical narrative, and tried to pull out the principles because I'm just not interested in any of this shit for myself. So I've just not really thought about it. I try to
even when a prostitute is brought before Jesus and ready to be stoned, which was the law, Jesus said, let him without sin throw the first stone. So there's obviously a lot of room for forgiveness even when it comes to prostitution. I'm not saying prostitution is the worst thing in the world, but it is the topic that's right now.
So basically what I would say is I believe that if you do something that you fully believe to be fine, and I mean, you're not coping or kidding yourself, because that's a really important thing, because there's a lot of people like, oh, no, I think this is fine. And you're like, there's no way that you believe that, right? If you fully believe what is fine, and especially if you're a Christian, you've prayed on it, you've done your biblical looking into it, you've really wrestled with God to go, is this behavior a sin or not? And then you say, it isn't. And you truly believe that you're fine and you don't have the knowledge otherwise that it's wrong, then I don't believe that it's wrong. That's my best interpretation of the Bible. And I always give the 5% of like, and I could be wrong because I'm not a teacher on theology.
Okay, finally. I finally feel like I understand a bit more. Okay.
I have like a hardcore disagreement though on the fact that you're not supposed to judge people who aren't Christians or that they're not sinning. Like it seems like the laws and the rules that God gives us and that the Bible gives us, again, I come from a fundamentalist background, so it's a bit different, but like we understand that these are just the rules. This is the way it is, that you're like...
I just reject that.
The idea that like you're not supposed to judge people who aren't Christians seems to, when they're talking about judgment, a lot of times they're talking about having some sort of punishment for them, holding them accountable. Not that you can't decide that they are sinning, because it does talk about non-Christian sinning, and it's saying that like, you know, not to hang around them, not to what does it say?
No,
like
it does not say that. It does not say that, because Jesus hung out with drunks, gluttons, and
yes, it talks about not allowing them to, like, I forget what it's called. It's like muddying the waters, or like, you know, being a bad influence on you is generally what it's saying, is that hanging around non-Christians that are sinning a lot can be a bad influence on you, and so you shouldn't hang out with people who are doing these sort of things. Like, it does reference people who are non-Christian sinning. It does talk about them sinning, which means that you have to, like, make a judgment that they are sinning in the first place in order to know.
Where does it talk about non-Christian sinning? Where specifically biblically do they talk about non-Christian sinning?
There's crap. Damn it, I went over this just the other day on stream.
Wait, maybe naive, but like, doesn't that run counter to the idea that we're all born in sin?
No,
I would
sin is like no sin. Kid. It's like this.
We don't have to. We don't have to.
It's real. Kid, it's real simple.
Don't even start.
That's a big can of worms. It's very theological.
I don't think it is. I think that if you get saved,
not.
your sins are forgiven, and if you're not saved, your sins are not forgiven, and so that is like the massive difference between the two.
Here comes the 2 hours.
Okay, so that's going to be a Protestant take on it. Catholics believe in sanctifying grace, for example. So I don't want to do like a big theological difference of like sanctifying grace and salvation and gospel of regeneration because it's really complex and boring.
Erudite. So in your heart of hearts, if you believe according to your system, if you're a Christian and you believe in your heart of heart that what you're doing is right, and you truly in good faith believe it, and you pray to God, and you know, and you think that God trusts in you, and like to any according action. If a Christian is killing somebody, and they have prayed to God about it, and they have truly believed that this is the good faith action to do it, are they justified according to your system?
Possibly because like God doesn't seem to fully condemn murder, war, for example, or like
so sure.
Or,
So
like,
even
I think most Christians would agree like self-defense is fine.
right. So even in the case of it's not self-defense, right? From your perspective, even if they feel like they're justified in doing, for example, if somebody angers them by kicking them in the shins and then they kill them in retaliation, you would feel like
there's no way in hell you're gonna justify that.
Yeah, I would say every single Christian would go, I'm a little sussed out by your theology here. Nobody would believe that they gave their theology a really honest shot. And so no, I would be very, very opposed to this. So I call, for example, Eastern Orthodox heretics all the time because I think that they're wrong about their theology. I think they're living in sin all the time. So like if some person literally was like, well, I'm just made mad enough, so God's okay with me killing, I'd be like, find that in the Bible. Good fucking luck. Jesus like got mad at Peter for like cutting off an ear, right? Like they talk about turning the other cheek. They talk about like carrying a coal on your head for their enemy. There's like, it's so hard to say. So maybe it could be true, but in a real world, I just can't even conceive of it. I would assume that they're lying or they're insane. And being like insane isn't going
in
to
the case of insane.
Like, justification. Yeah.
Right, but being insane, for example, like why would that not be the case again in like in a one sentence answer again or two sentence?
There's no insanity theologically is really tough. So especially because
insanity, not even discounting insanity. If they believe in the heart of hearts that they believe they're justified in killing in anger, right? Then how do you feel like
then
that
they're
is
demented? It's not
not demented. I don't think that's a good argument.
I get it. Hold on. I'll just engage with you. Hypothetically, there is a world possibly where they could sit me down, walk me through their theology, their prayer and everything, and potentially that I could be like, okay, sure. I guess maybe not. But in the real world, I literally can't imagine it. It doesn't seem reasonable based on any of the readings biblically that I have done. So I am saying hypothetically, in my world, yes, that could be true because that would be consistent with my world. But in the real world application, it's extremely unlikely to occur. I can't even imagine it.
Yeah, but the problem with that is that like in an alternate timeline, right? Like obviously you can go like, yeah, but we live in this reality, not in an alternate timeline or whatever, right? In an alternate timeline, I can totally picture where people have built up this entire framework and this worldview where they can actually justify like these reprehensible actions.
That would be a sin. That would be a sin. You're making up your own.
But to them, it's not a sin. But to them, it's not
really
a sin, right?
Do you want me to answer? Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, I do want you to answer. I'm doing this in good faith. Trust me. Yeah.
I know. It's just if you keep like interrupting me and stuff, it's really hard to respond. So what I would say is, if you've convinced yourself something in bad faith that does go against your conscience, that your Holy Spirit is saying this is not good, then it doesn't count and you are accountable for it, which is why I'm saying in the real world, I literally can't imagine a situation where I would believe that in good faith, a person has come biblically, spiritually, and divinely to the conclusion that they can just kill somebody because they're like upset at them. I can't imagine it.
It sounds like I feel like the answer is really simple, where it's like
it just goes inherently against the teaching.
Sorry. So it seems like the only real distinction to care about here is that there is judgment between humans, which we'll call morality, and then the judgment of God, which we can't know for sure, but you can learn towards understanding through the scripture.
Scripture, so exegesis, eisegesis, and divine revelation is typically how we do
the problem I have with your argument is it's an argument of convenience, right? Is that the Bible just happened to have all the right arguments for you, so then you just happen to have all the right things in order and you lucked it into we built up until the system, right?
No.
Why is that not true?
That's not what you're
That
saying.
doesn't make sense.
I think you're misunderstanding me. I think maybe it's because do you have much experience or like background in Christian
Wait,
theology
in
at all?
theology, no. I'm
Okay,
trying to
super
figure
fair,
this
super
out
fair.
from a commoner
Are
perspective,
you?
right? Like that's what I'm
Did you grow
trying.
up? Yeah, that's super fair. I just so I can understand what world you're probably living in.
Yeah.
Have you mostly been exposed to North American Protestants for the most part when it comes to
Protestants? No, not Protestants. No, I
like
just,
Baptists
no,
and
just
stuff like
been
that?
avoiding not politics, avoiding religion in general, like overall, I would say. Like I'm
Okay,
completely divorced from religion
okay,
in
super
all
super fair.
forms.
Okay, um, so one heresy that I think exists is called biblical deconstructivism. So what you're saying from an argument of convenience would require biblical deconstruction, where basically it's like the classic like CSI case where the evil guy is like, God told me, and he gets like 3 verses that kind of suggest towards like some sort of like Machiavellian killing, and he's like, see, God's saying it. And I would just reject this because I think it's a heretical way to read the Bible. I would say that is bad faith. You are convicted of sin. You are doing sin because you're doing things that are theologically unsound and goes against your conscience. You're just so caught up in your own emotions. You're trying to bend the Bible towards your will, which I wholly reject. So biblical deconstruction, where you just take a couple of verses to like build up a narrative, is bad. I reject that.
So
I'm not for that.
sure, but can't they say the same about your interpretation as well? Like they're saying, "Oh, you're trying to bend the Bible to your will," and like
They'll
your
have to
conscience
prove it.
makes against that. How do they
Well,
prove that?
they can, right? Anyone can say whatever they want because like sola scriptura fundamentalism is like handy because you can basically just say everything is literally capital T true and it's like one and done. So they can say that. And this is the issue. God's going to know who's right and God's going to be able to judge me. All I can do is do the best possible interpretation. I know that that seems dissatisfying, but the reason why I would
No,
say
it's
that
not
they're wrong.
dissatisfying. I'm just trying to figure it out. That's all. Yeah.
Sure. The reason why I would say they're incorrect is it's not like I'm just picking a couple of verses to create my worldview, because believe me,
Mm.
it would be easier to just not be a Christian at this point or to like be a fundamentalist, because the worldviews are like kind of handy. They work together a little bit more cleanly. But the reality is like
Yeah.
I'm spending a lot of time theologically to wrestle through trying to figure out what I think my God is saying as best as I can. So they can say that against me, but it's not like I don't have very robust theological underpinnings that are
So
backing
there's
what
a
I'm saying.
I mean, there's even a like a anti-realist parallel to this as well. Whereas, like, if you were to say that like you don't believe that there is objective like moral truths, does that mean that you necessarily have to prescribe to a sort of like nihilism, that like everything is necessarily like permitted? And like you can still give answers for what you think is like a consistent framework of how you would want other people to act, and you can make these arguments while being good faith without taking the position that like that you think you should just be able to do whatever you want.
Right.
Okay, I see. Do you, from what I understand, there are some parts in the Bible that are unsavory, right? For example, like stuff with like rape and murder
Not
and
having
whatever,
sex with his
right?
daughters. Yeah.
Yeah.
Called cherry picking.
Right. So what makes you cherry pick your thing to form your own narrative and to interpret the Bible in that way versus somebody else who would cherry pick the worst examples to form their way to justify some like terrible act and then to
So
whatever?
in fairness, I do have to reject the framing of the question, because you're basically
Oh,
saying, how come you can cherry pick things and other people can't? And I'm like, I'm not. I
We're
reject
looking at
the
it from the
framing that
whole.
I'm cherry picking. Yeah. So I do understand what your question is like getting
so
at. I
so
just
how
want to
would
make
you
it
interpret the worst parts of the Bible then yourself?
sure. So oh man, do you know the difference between the moral law and the ceremonial law?
No, sorry.
Okay, so do you know, here's a famous one. Do you know how back in the Old Testament people weren't allowed to eat pigs? Have you heard about that? Or like shrimp
Uh,
or like crustaceans?
I think I've heard something like that. Is that why like pork is forbidden and stuff
In
in
the Old
some?
Testament. Yeah, so
Blood
that's
and
part of the
herbs, yeah.
For
ceremonial
like
law,
Jewish people
basically.
and yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and a couple people keep it.
Same
There's
as
like
tattoos and piercings.
yes, or dressing, men dressing as women and women dressing as men. These are all kind of part of the ceremonial law, basically. And so the issue is that in a lot of these like awful things and this world that we're outlining, we have to look at, are you a presentist at all? I'm not sure how you view like history. Like if you
What
think
does that
something's
mean?
immoral, so like we all agree that slavery is immoral, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you think that we were always immoral the whole time? Like every single person who ever participated in any level of slavery in history ever was always immoral?
Ever no.
No.
I mean, the thing is, if you were
Okay.
born in Nazi Germany, like you would probably be a Nazi, right? And I couldn't blame you for being a Nazi in that period, so I couldn't assign blame to like a person who born in Nazi Germany during that time, right?
Yeah. So most of the unsavory stuff comes from the Old Testament. So we have to remember that these are like some of these books date back as far as like I think like 5500 BC. So a very, very, very different world. So like for example, like God commanding them about like going to war and stuff like that. I'm going to read it much more from a moral law perspective than ceremonial law. So the moral law is basically like New Testament stuff. So that's essentially about like the principles that God wants us to live and outlines for Christians to be like. And so once Jesus died, essentially, in a really reductive way, I'm being super reductive. Basically, the old covenant was broken where they had to like kill lambs and shit. Jesus is the new lamb. He's covered us with his blood. And now we're under a new covenant. And so this is why Paul says, for example, like the old law is dead. This is why most Protestants, for example, wear cloth of two fiber and they'll they'll eat pork most of the time and stuff like that, because basically the ceremonial law doesn't apply anymore under the new covenant. So
Okay.
when you look, so there's a couple things. Number one, some of the unsavory stuff is going to be like mythologized stories about a people in the context of the culture that they exist in, where it's like, yeah, there's genocides going on, there's like horrible things going on. I don't think that that's really God being like, God, I love genocide, right? I think what it is it's a mythologized story in the cultural context that these people were existing in. You know, like God was like guiding them through. So I don't look through this and go, well, can I genocide people now? What I look through is and I go, well, I don't live in a culture where things like tribalism and war are standard. But is there a principle that I can get pulled out of here that's different? For example, one principle that might get pulled out is like things like purity or setting yourself apart. A lot of people will use like the mythology, even Protestants do this, of like the different tribes that we are opposed like represent different types of sins that Christians have to deal with. And so when they talk about like killing all the like lambs, children, everything, it's about this idea of like maximal purity, like do not even allow the temptation of sin to like enter into your heart, stuff like that. And so
Well,
So
when I look,
there's
I'm
also
not sure if that answers your question, but yeah.
there's
yeah,
also the idea that because I've been hit with this talk about that before, is that God is never changing. God is, God was, and God will always be. So in something that goes directly to that point is Jesus went on during his time on earth taught a lot with parables. He taught a lot with stories that weren't true. It's not something that like factually happened, but he taught through stories, and the moral of the story kind of led to what he was trying to teach. And so that kind of lends hand to prove that say God is, God was, and God will always be.
okay, was that directed at me or?
I'm just further backing up what was stated.
Oh, okay. Okay. So let me get it right of what you're saying, right? So you're saying like when God rains fire upon a city or something like that, right? It's less like God is saying, "Oh, I permit you to rain fire upon a city," in the modern day or something like that. It's more about why did God do that and what made God do that? Is that what you're saying?
So, oh man, this is so complicated. Basically, what I'm saying is that A, I'm not being presentist. B, I'm
Okay.
mythologizing. I don't know if I actually believe that Sodom and Gomorrah literally happened. I think it's allegory. I don't think God
Wait.
literally like turned people in. So I don't think it literally happened. I don't think like it's capital T true in like a historical way. I don't think you can find Sodom and Gomorrah and find pillars of salt that was Lot's wife or whatever, and find like a burnt out city with like 99% pure sulfur, which like Protestants try to claim. I don't believe that. I think it's allegory. So what I go, if that's an allegory, what is the principle being taught in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? Because I don't believe it's literally true. What did the story
Wait,
mean to the people being told about law?
Right, that's what I'm saying, right? That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying like, oh, this literally has some kind of like historical accuracy to it. I'm saying like, okay, what is the story behind it? Why was the story told? And like, what are the ethics behind the story, right? Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I'm trying
So
to.
if I can, because I brought up ceremonial and moral, and I feel like that was too long-winded. So if I can tie what I'm saying here back to that, the reason why it's important to understand ceremonial and moral law is because during the Old Testament, the Jews had the first covenant. That's the ceremonial law. And this was governed by, this was the sacrifices. There's very specific types of sacrifices that had to be made for certain types of behaviors. It is, if you want to go read the books, they're the most boring, awful books to read on the planet because it's just listing like, well, no, the genealogy book is worse. But other than that, it's just like listing crimes and then all the types of sacrifices you have to do, right? That's ceremonial law. There's a list of rules and regulations that were given to Jews that were basically like intended to help them survive the brutality of the past. The new covenant is governed by the moral law. That's Christ, right? And the purpose of this moral law is to have us move towards our best to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, and to love our God with our heart, soul, and mind. That's the moral law fundamentally. So like the end goal is essentially try to be kind, try to be good, and try to treat other well. And like, you all sing Kumbaya and Happy Land at the end of the day. So I feel like now I'm being even more esoteric. I was trying to be simple, but now I feel like I'm being more esoteric. Sodom and Gomorrah's allegory. I think
I understand majority of what you're talking about. So yeah, don't worry about it. Yeah.
I mean, it's going to get more and more esoteric as we go along this line of questioning too. I mean,
then maybe it's good to zoom out a little bit.
Real quick before you interrupt. The thing that that we're gonna have to deal with at some point is that, as Erudite said, this is going to become tautological, and so as long as you understand that the foundation of what Erudite is saying is that that for us, we judge each other morally based on how we want to live, and for God, Christians will try to find the most reasonable way to live in the eyes of God. And if you just take that standpoint, then you can understand exactly what Erudite is talking about. You don't have to go into why, how are you going to justify this thing that's said in the Bible or whatever. At the end of the day, it's going to be how good faith are you being with the Scripture, and how you think people should be acting morally within a society, and specifically the society that you exist in. Once you have that down, you basically understand what's going on.
Yeah, I actually think it's important to note here that all moral systems come to tautologies. They have to, right? Whatever you decide is good is a tautology. At the end of the day,
moral systems are tautological, yes.
Yes, right? So if you're like, some utilitarians will basically say, what is good is like reducing harm. Well, what's reducing harm? At some point you go, well, reducing harm is good. Well, why is it good? It's good because it reduces harm. And goodness is reducing harm because reducing harm is good, right? It's
or even with the Sam Harris thing of one thing that Sam Harris said, because he has a scientifically based objective morality system where
the moral landscape.
So he'll say something where if you touch a stove, that's going to hurt, and so therefore you know that it's bad, and then therefore, and this is something that I would criticize him for, he would say that therefore you ought not do that thing. And that's sort of a logical leap, and that's when it becomes tautological. But if you have an objective moral system, it's always going to be falling back onto that. Because my criticism would be that the only thing that shows, the fact that it has to come to a tautological basis, means that there is no objective truth value to any moral statement. That's the thing that I would take issue with.
Right. And then a Christian would say, my God gives it objective value because my God is good. And what my
Yeah.
God says is good is good. Yeah, exactly. This is the problem with all philosophy when you get to the really basic level. This is why when Christians say that like BPF will say atheist objectivists are silly and ridiculous and their ideas are just, I'm like, it's literally as tautological as what you believe, you fucking idiot. It's the same shit.
He doesn't even seem to have problems with the tautological part. From the conversations that I've had with him, he seems to have an issue with the fact that they're not objective, and that he's okay with his objective morality being tautological. He's just not okay with any sort of morality that's not objective, because then it's a lesser value, and any sort of subjective system is going to have lesser value to him. He
would appeal to some level of if he was talking to Kid, he would basically be so you're just saying there's there's no thing that we can know of being like, yeah, this just is wrong, right?
Yeah,
Like
and I
we
would
can
say
be,
yes, Giga Chad. Yeah.
yeah, basically, yeah. Which is why we had a
So,
long drunken fight about morality.
Yeah, or
Mrs.
like a
Erudite,
system
Stop
built
reminding me
like,
of that. I was so
or like a
drunk.
system built like
the
by
issue is
humans
BPF
is
thinks,
worse than a system
well,
built by a god or things like that.
BPF thinks that his system is self-justifying, but that any other moral system cannot be self-justifying because God doesn't exist within it, which is silly. All tautologies are like self-justifying necessarily.
Mrs. Erudite, would you say that?
Mrs. Erudite, that's very cute.
Yeah, of course. So Mrs. Erudite, would you say that when it comes to tautologies and etc., would like moral subjectivity also like is it also subject to that?
Most moral subjectivists would be, they're typically anti-realists and therefore wouldn't believe in like an objective morality. I'm not as studied, this is actually a better kid question because I'm not as studied in like the depths of subjectivism, but a lot of them actively are subjective because they
Right.
reject the
Right,
tautology.
because
Yeah.
right, because I think people have questioned, like other religious people have questioned my thing before. It's like, okay, I get my values from God. Where do you get your values from, right? Like in a nutshell. And I would say, okay,
Right.
I get my value. It's not like, oh, I was born out of my mother's womb and I instantly get my set of values, right? I was born out of my mother's womb into specifically this environment in this time period, and society has already built upon itself up until like this society right now, and I'm building off of this society's rules and like general moral framework of like the bell curve, like the general bell curve of moral frameworks, and then I can make my own adjustments from there, right? And then
But
that is where
generally,
I
if
get
anybody's
my
ever asking that question,
framework.
they're asking about some sort of axiomatic value of which everything else builds out from. So, like, if you're saying, like, oh, well, yours starts with God, this is the foundation, and then everything comes from that. Like Erudite
say
mentioned,
human
like, you can have,
civilization.
like, a rule
Yeah.
utilitarian thing that's based on harm, or you can have, like, a bunch of different systems that have some sort of axiomatic value at the
Right.
beginning, and then everything else builds out from there because you have the foundation that tells you how to decide what is good or bad.
Right, to which I would say the indomitable human spirit, right?
But again, then we
That
go,
was
well, what
mainly
does that
meme. That was
mean?
mainly meme. That was mainly
Yeah.
meme. Sorry.
Okay.
But it's actually a really good point because one thing that's been really interesting to me about people's like backlash to me outlining my like moral system is they're like, it's so ridiculous and like arbitrary. I'm like, most moral systems are like, yes, and most people have thought way less about their moral system. It's actually really tough. Like when people get to the nitty gritty of being like, well, what do you think is goodness, right? If I ask like you, Food, like what is good? What makes something good? Is there an objective goodness or is it all subjective? And if it's all subjective, are you just saying there isn't a true goodness? You kind of like do the best you can. Okay, well, how do you base that off of? What are your guideposts, right? So again, we get into kind of like the same murky questions that actually are being lobbed at me as well.
You know what's so funny is that at first, most people just go like, oh, what is good? And it's like vibes wise, right? Like, oh, if this vibe feels good, then it's good, right?
Yes.
But then I would go, okay, then what about this and this and this in this scenario? Okay, stealing something in this scenario is bad, but then stealing something in this scenario is good, right? So therefore stealing is like different in different scenarios, right? But then eventually I feel like at some point you're arguing too far, and then at some point it just becomes way too like debate broy, and then I just go back to vibes again. Like it's just for me, I just feel like I'm going back to vibes, and vibes is it's like asking,
exactly.
Oh, what what is a chair, right? A chair could be one leg, it could be two legs or four legs, but then you can, is an elephant a chair just because you can sit on an elephant, right? So it's like I don't know, it just feels like somewhat like vibes, you know what I mean? But it is
So,
what
like,
it is.
this would be my criticism of this, is that like that's always going to be a fundamental problem if you're speaking about morality in objective terms. That's the problem. Is that what I would say when we're dealing with morality? We're dealing with things like drives that we've developed through an evolutionary process as social animals, and that we develop these moral intuitions based on these things of like Sam Harris says, like if you touch something hot, it feels bad, so you know not to do that, so you ought not do that thing. And then we develop these moral intuitions over time that feel so powerful in our human brains that it's hard to even think of them outside of objective terms. But once we start trying to put objective terms to moral systems, then we start falling into all of these logical traps and all of these tautologies that we cannot actually justify. And that's the problem that we're talking about here.
But the issue is then the question is, so does that mean everything's meaningless? And if not, how do we determine meaning?
Yes, I would say GigaChad emoji. Yes, everything is meaningless. Yes.
No, it has meaning because vibes, right?
Right, and the vibes are so strong that it must have like objective meaning to it. Yeah.
I mean, generally,
Yeah.
like meaning is going to be based on value. Value is going to be based on what you decide is valuable. Like if you believe in subjectivity, you can still believe that there's meaning and value to things. It's just going to be based on your own subjective way of valuing things. And so it's,
Right. But then you get into the trick of like, how do you answer the question of the guy who feels really, really justified? It makes him really happy to kill people. And like, he's like constructed a world where like when he kills people, he like kills people who are like already wanting to be euthanized. And so it's like the most like least harm possible done. Like, is
Well,
he
the
ethically
answer there would to be you to justify why you don't want that to happen because it could have negative implications for you. It wouldn't be an argument about whether or not that thing is actually objectively wrong or not. It would be whether or not you want that thing to happen.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say whether or not I want it to happen to me. I would say whether or not, as you know, whether or not society can exist if we allowed that thing to happen. Like if we said like, yeah, you can't go outside without being, without worrying about getting murdered or being stolen from, like society just would not be able to operate in any way. And so like we would have to make it to where people can't do this or this is shamed or it's against the law so that it happens less.
Yeah, so we're giving our own personal justification for why we would not want that thing to happen in the world based on how we want to exist in the world. And that's the start and the end of that. But once you start saying that like you must have an objective answer as to whether or not this thing is right or wrong, you're going to be getting into a situation of like when we talk about like human rights or inalienable rights or like what kind of rights do humans have. When we're talking about rights, these are things that like cannot be like what's the word I'm looking for? They're inalienable. Like you just have these rights, and that kind of begs the question of like, or what, or else what? And then we're back into the realm of society and laws and just how we would want to organize with each other in the first place. So there still is no rational basis for just assuming that there's a objective framework for dealing with any of these problems that you're going to be finding in the depths of like meta ethics or anything. Once you get down to this like evolutionary perspective of this and why we feel the things that we do, you're kind of fucked when it comes to trying to find justification outside of that.
Speaking of
It's
perspective, Perspective Philosophy just popped in the chat, so I told him to jump in because I know he's also a Christian and this is what he talks about most of the time. So
Hey, it's more Christian
he might
stuff.
be here soon. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Archaeology.
fuck. But in the meantime, dude, I'm so glad I didn't grow up around religion. Thank God. Okay, not thank God. Okay, but just
As a Christian, I would say, I kind of agree with you, but also I think my God's pretty based.
This is my Taliban approved edition of the Quran. Okay, but anyway, the point is that like when I think of the social contract theory, right, and how people come up with things to include inside the social contract that everybody can feel like they can go, like, don't intrude upon my personal space, like don't go within 2 inches of me. Like, who the hell is deciding these things, and who is including things inside the social contract? At the end of the day, you can't really form a really good justification of why we include the things inside of the social contract other than vibes, and just, yeah, it is what it is.
Well, you can suggest that we have a moral code that is inherent to being human. You can suggest that is a different possibility. We're not left with only vibes.
I mean,
You're
different
just
people
you're
have different
just
justifications.
you're just specifically unwilling to.
Hold on. Yes, I think that she's saying that she already rejects that as a decent argument,
Right,
and
but-
that's already like out of the picture.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that that's not the only thing we're left with. We're left with 2 options. You're just unwilling to accept one of the options.
Wait, can you explain my hypocrisy again?
So I'm not saying you're being Hippocratic. I'm just saying that there was a falsity in what you were saying. Is that when you take all this into consideration, that there we're only left with vibes. That's all we're left with.
We could do contractualism.
If you inherently reject that we have a moral code as a human being, then yes, that's all we're left with. But that's still another option, is we have moral code as a human being.
I reject that we have a moral code, but I do think we have empathy. I think that we have empathy. I think that we have.
I'm just suggesting that
be a contractualist.
Things like that.
It is whatever we say it is, because we generally want what makes us happier, or at least not dying as often.
Right, and that's sort of the thing, is that like, I would have to ask where like the that moral code comes from. How come it's not represented throughout like all of human history? What are the things that are represented throughout all of human history, and why does that divert from like the evolutionary process?
Religion.
But like outside of like, once you start getting into like, oh well, like I'm a Christian or something like that, that's the end of the conversation. That's it.
Yeah, like I'm like a contractualist, and
like I think that there like you can debate whether or not like it's justified for people to believe in Christianity if you want to, but ultimately I think you're going to be coming across like the Kierkegaardian the two options that you have. You either have the option of like just giving yourself up to the faith in religion, or abandoning all of it and relying on these notions of like the evolutionary process and like digging into it in that direction of this like anti-realist framework. You basically have those two options, and once you get someone that's saying that like, oh well, I'm a Christian, fundamentally I believe that there is a God, and this God has gives me these axiomatic beliefs. Once you get to that point, the only other thing that you can do is try and reason with someone as to whether or not it's justified logically for them to have that belief system. But good luck.
Do you think that all religious people are on like only one side of the Euthyphro dilemma?
I don't know. I don't know if I know enough about like different religions to say so. I think generally with like Christianity, yeah.
Okay. Do you think that God gets to decide what is good and bad, or is God subject to it, basically?
If God gets to decide what is good and bad.
This is a really,
let me
really
try to think about this in like the framework that you gave earlier, about because you were saying that good and bad is something that like human beings are going to be like judging each other based on whether or not like their moral systems are consistent with the things that they believe. So you have like a more like subjectivist framework. I don't think you necessarily like. I think
relativist, not subjectivist.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, relativist. I don't know if that's like necessarily contradictory.
Like, is God subsequent under the good? Is it the good and God serves it? Or is it God and he just gets to decide what's good and bad? Because this is what I think I feel like a lot of people misunderstand about religious people, is that there is no agreement on this. Like, most Catholics feel one way, whereas Protestants often feel a very different way about this answer.
I don't know.
If God served good, then he wouldn't truly be God. God decides what is good and what is bad. It's his law that we follow.
Sure, but it could be a combination of both, where you're saying that there is some sort of thing that he is looking for at the end. So like generally when Christians talk about what is good, it's about like what makes God happy or what serves God, right? There is some sort of system still that God is deciding what is good for based on that system.
But wait, God
has necessarily has to be good. Then
God has said
the only
he's the perfect
justification that you have for
example,
God
that
is
he is
giving
good.
it an excuse to have your moral system.
Sure, but God can't be bad, though. That's the thing, is that God can't possibly be bad. If it's based on his will, then he couldn't possibly be bad, because he's always doing his will.
Right.
Yes.
So Catholics believe that good exists like primordially, and that God will only do what is good, essentially. Not all Catholics, obviously, there's a varying. But the Catholics have decided that Aristotle was right in the Euthyphro dilemma, right? That God is a slave to goodness, essentially. And like most Catholics would not like the way I'm putting that, but yeah.
So isn't a good example of like this divide between a lot of Christians is the interpretation of the story of Job? About whether or not like it was a moral action to like sacrifice his son for God just because God said so.
You mean Abraham?
Yeah,
is it? Sorry, I might be mixing it up.
And sorry, I meant Socrates, not Aristotle. I think I said Aristotle for Socrates. I apologize. Don't
Yeah,
ask.
the point is
Okay,
that if it is
so-
about God's will, they are using a system, and so it would be both. That like there is a system in which it's decided whether or not something is good, and it is always going to be based on what it is that God wants. So yeah, it literally
Well,
ends
this
up
is the
being
issue.
both.
Well, a lot of theologians would say it's one or the other. It's not both. You have to pick, right? Like it's hard to make it work at the same time. Either whatever God says is good just is good, or there's a primordial good that God is a slave to and he like represents.
Sure, if you're saying that you can't
If you're
use
Christian. believe
him,
in God.
like if you're saying you can't use God's will as the primordial system, then of course, like then I feel like it would be obvious that it is just God's will, that like he created everything, and if he created and designed everything, it would have to be that he also designed what
it
is
according
good.
to his will.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
So the
not
question is,
according to his
can
will,
God
because
make
obviously
what
there's
is
free
good
will.
evil, and what is evil good tomorrow? Could he do that? Or would he
No, wait,
be
but if I
unable to do
design it,
that?
if I create something, I create it according to my will. I'm not beholden to my will, but I did it according to my will. I made it how I wanted it to be, correct?
Sure, to some extent. So I guess what not so weird that you're asking is like then if he could snap his fingers and just make everything according to the way that he wants it and everything would be perfect, we would always say, well, he won't do that because there's like this value of free will, that we have to choose him, we have to come to God, we have to accept him into our hearts, and that if we're making that decision like under coercion or we're being forced to do it, then it's not the same. Then that means there is this higher thing that is saying that free will is actually a high value, and that this is important, and that God is valuing that free will instead of deciding that free will is important, because otherwise he would just snap his fingers.
He
Right.
will eventually. He's just trying to give us the time of day to accept him prior to that.
Sure, but
The
why?
free will though is like a step down from all this, right? Like what we're talking about is like the really boring, annoying shit, which is basically like, does God only do what is good, or does God decide what good is?
Hello. Can you hear us
Hi.
now?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Hello. I'm a Catholic. I think I think what you're trying to express is the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yep. We were talking
yeah.
about the Euthyphro dilemma.
But I think that the Aristotelian response isn't to make isn't to take one side or the other. It's actually to say that the dichotomy is a false one. It's not to say that God is a slave to good. It's to say God is goodness, and so he is only representing his own self. So he is only willing himself, and so is not acting in accordance with anything other than his own power.
Sure, so let me ask you the same thing that I just said. Okay, so if God could snap his fingers and make everything good, make it to where everybody was not sinning, we would generally say that he won't do that because he wants us to have like free will. He wants us to accept him. He wants us to choose to accept him. He wants us to choose to come to him, right? Why does he want us to choose to do that? Did he decide that that is a thing that is better? Or is that a thing that is just actually better? That there is something better about us making the choice to come to him on our own?
I would say it's the same thing. What you're asking is essentially the same thing. Like when you say, like, did he decide that it is better, or is it just better? It's like when you look at God being what is essentially a logos, it's a logical relation, like an identity relation. Then essentially you don't have to think of it like, did God arbitrarily do this or not? It's God did it because it's in accordance with his own nature. So when you talk about like the goodness of being, like when we talk about good in the first place, I think we actually have to understand it, and this is where I'm a continental.
I'm sorry, but I think the question is then, like, why wouldn't he decide that then? Like, why wouldn't he decide that then just, like, that the decision isn't all that important in snapping his fingers and making it to where we didn't have free will and we just were doing the right thing? Why wouldn't that be the choice then? Why wouldn't he do that?
Yeah,
Like,
I have a question actually from a third party. Sorry, you
I wanted
can
to
finish.
answer that
but-
real quick, yeah.
Yeah. The point isn't to say that he's it's not that you can't bring around the good without remember that what he's doing is maximizing himself. He's when we talk about goodness and freedom from an Aristotelian standpoint, it is actually just obtaining your form. So the whole point of having to freely choose to accept God is choosing to accept the good as your own form. And so it's elevating yourself out of original sin. So it is the act of perfection. So it's not something that can be thrown away. It's necessary, but it's also something that has to be done through volition. So it is like God wills it because it is the good, not because it's arbitrarily the good. He can't just it's not that he
God can only do what
it.
is good.
So wait, does
Yeah,
so
but
that would
Wait,
so
I
that
thought
would
you just said a minute ago
so
that
wait,
God's
that would
will
be the-
is what is good, though. So you're saying
that
it's,
would
a,
mean
it's
good.
both.
God is a slave to goodness. He would
Sure,
never
so
not do anything that isn't good.
Sure,
yes.
but
It's
okay,
not
so,
a slave. No, but remember,
Yeah,
I know you
he's-
don't like the language. I know I'm being facetious with
it's-
the language a little bit, but
it's not even that. It's the whole point is to say it's freedom itself because he's obtaining himself. It's like he's
You're-
actually
One second.
obtaining his form.
well, you're saying it's only
One
good
second,
because
so-
God decided that it's good, and that because God decided it's good, that's why it is good, right?
No,
One
it's like
second.
God is good. Sorry.
So that if God
this
is
is getting.
beholden
I
to
think we're
this,
just getting semantic now.
if God is beholden to this good, then good would have to exist without God.
No.
Just so it's clear, him and I are saying the same thing as far as like I don't actually agree with this perspective, but when we're saying God only does what is good, that's what he's saying too. I don't know. I hope
But
you're not
in
disagreeing
order
with
for that
me.
to happen-
Any
No,
disagreement would be
I'm
God would
saying
good
the
would have
same
to
thing, yeah.
in order for that to happen, good would have to exist without God.
No.
Yes,
like,
because
this
if
is
God is
the- no.
beholden to something,
No, this is like, so basically this debate stems from a debate in the Catholic Church, which is called the problem of universals, where essentially it's where we start talking about, does a universal concept exist? Like this is where you get things like exaggerated realism, indifferentism, and like nominalism. So like when you see something like goodness and you see God as being subordinate to it, you see it as like a real thing that's goodness, separate from beings which experience goodness. An Aristotelian wouldn't see that. An Aristotelian would say something being good is something being itself. It's like actually obtaining itself. It's more of the fact that in contemporary times, the way we see good has changed.
What
then
side
God's
of the
not
Euthyphro
beholden
dilemma?
to it.
I have a
What side of the
separate
Euthyphro
question.
dilemma do you come out on? Just super simply, what side of the Euthyphro dilemma?
I think it's a false dichotomy. I don't think there is. There's no reason to place it in that.
That's what I said.
It's a tautology. You're talking about the same thing.
I have a separate question, if I may ask. So does God know everything that is and will happen ever?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, if that is the case, then he knows exactly who will go to hell, right?
Yes.
Yes.
If that is a wait, I
Are
don't
you
know if I'm
are you gonna
entirely-
say if he knows what's
I'm
going
not
to happen,
comfortable
then
with
do
that.
you
I
have
don't know.
free will?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm entirely comfortable with that.
So
right?
where you're
Because-
going, where you're, I can see where you're going, and where you're going
Yeah.
is that like God is predestined people to heaven or hell.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna put it this way.
So yeah.
So have you ever known someone so well that you pretty much knew exactly what they wanted without them even saying a word?
Know exactly what they wanted without saying yeah.
Okay, so multiply that times like infinity. God knows us so well. He knows what choices we will make out of our free will. He knows us so well. He knows he can determine what path we're going to take with our free will.
Yeah. So like even look at it like this, right? If you're outside of time and you perceive every action, you perceive it as a simultaneous event. But that doesn't mean that all of the events weren't separable and logically distinct and made from other causal entities. It just means that you perceive them simultaneously. So like if you can even think of this in terms of like, did you ever seen Interstellar?
Yes.
Do you know the point when he's in the black hole and he's
oh,
going through?
it's you're talking about if you're one dimension above, then you can see like time stretched out as a worm, and you can see like the different segments of time, and you can
Yeah.
right.
It's essentially like if you're just affirming like an eternalist standpoint from time, then all of those events are real, but that doesn't mean that God necessarily caused those events to happen externally to the fact that he sustained those events to happen. So he let us do what we want with the power that we have, and he knows the conclusion, but that doesn't mean that he makes them all.
So he doesn't have a hand in creating the fates of the people beforehand, right?
He does and
Correct.
he doesn't. The only thing that, and this is why Aquinas says the only thing that God wills is himself. The only thing that he does is will himself.
So he basically creates the world and then just lets the humans be.
I mean, apart from the fact that he sends his son and all of that, but it's more of the fact that he cares about us, he loves us, and he wants us to reach salvation. But it's one of those things where we're the ones that keep fucking up.
He wants to be willingly sought out instead of being forced to. Instead of us being like slaves to him, he wants us to willingly choose him.
All right,
Sure.
hold on.
Consent.
Let KidNotKin go.
Yeah, I have a question. This is probably going to be a pretty rudimentary one for yourself. But when you're talking about how God knows the future of all actions of everybody, how do you reconcile this with I think I remember you believe, or you said earlier that you believe in free will as well at the same time, right? Even though in the eyes of God it is predetermined. I'm speaking to perspective philosophy.
Right. Yeah, I do believe in free will. I think this is why I think it's really important when we talk about what do we mean by free will, what we talk about when we mean by will. When from an Aristotelian standpoint, or even from the standpoint of prior to the 16th century, really, the idea of freedom wasn't to just to do what you want or to get what you want. It was essentially to abide by what is rational, and what is rational is essentially the principle which governs you, right? So if you think of your reason as essentially like a practical exercise in achieving what is good for you, and what is good for you is determined by your nature, which is determined by God, then being free is essentially abiding by your God-given nature. So
Can I ask you a question once you're done, sir?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, so when you think about it like this, don't think of it like there is this overarching force. So God can create you as a principality, having its own causal interactions, right? Think of it as a separate causal sequence. So he creates a causal sequence which has a subsequence within it, which can then make its own effects onto the world, right? It has a level of indeterminacy separate from him, or its own causal sequence. He sustains that into being. But then
okay, so can I reframe this a little bit? Just for people with toddler brains like myself. So this would basically be the idea of if God lives outside of time, metaphysically speaking, what we're going to be implying here is that not just that he knows every single action that's going to come, but you're saying that he knows every possible action. Yes,
he knows every action from the standpoint of a being before time was created, from the standpoint of a being after time was created, atemporally, quote unquote, and he knows that, and he would know it from the standpoint of the creatures experiencing it in those moments.
Okay, so this seems like almost like a I mean, it makes sense from your perspective that this is kind of like a separation between the I guess if you're trying to explain something that could experience something outside of time, you would have to take this kind of perspective, but it's not necessarily tied to the subject of free will per se.
Yeah, I mean, it is and it isn't. It's obviously that what we can and cannot do is determined by God, but he gives us the possibilities of action. So sure, we can choose to deny ourselves or to deny him and deny ourselves. We can be irrational. That's on us. But as long as we attempt to be rational,
okay, so then
he offers
the
mercy.
Problem that I would have is if we are talking about a God that knows everything that is going to happen versus a God that knows everything that could happen, it feels like there's an inconsistency here. It feels like these are the exact opposite answer of if God can know everything that could possibly happen, but you do have free will, that's a little bit different than God knowing everything that is necessarily going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, like, look at it like this. What is causation in the first place? Like, it's just a logical relation, right? Like, it's not something that's you don't have to look at it at a point of temporality where it's like all it really is an identity relation between two events, a logical inference between two events, where event A necessarily is antecedent or consequent from event B, right? So like, so if you look at it from that perspective, if one of the causes for the events is separate from God's will, and it's like our will, then that's our freedom. But in order to be truly free, as in like actually be at home in ourselves, like where people would go, all right, you're not just free, but you've embraced your freedom, or if that makes sense to you, you know, where it would say like people like often say like, you know, you like people enslave themselves and stuff like that, you know, or you're a slave to your desires or something like that, right?
Sure.
Then you've got to abide by what's good, and that's
Okay, that's fine. I think Erudite had a question.
Yeah. Do you think that God can make good evil and evil good tomorrow? Like you just snap his fingers and everything that we view as evil is now good, and whatever we viewed as good is now evil. Could he do that?
I don't think that logical contradictions are coherent, so I don't think that was a question. Let's say, could he make a square circle? Could he make black white? I don't know what you mean.
So you
Wait,
just want to
what?
answer the question?
Yeah.
So
No, I think
God
this
is
not
defined
coherent.
by our human logic.
No, I
Because
think
it's
logic.
incoherent to us.
No,
No,
he's
it's
saying
just
logic is
incoherent.
defined by God. Like, but if we're saying that God decided what is good, he would have to be able to decide good is something else. You would have
Well,
you would have to
that's
say
if
that.
God. Yeah, but you're saying if God decided what is good, but if God is good, then it's like God decided not to be himself today.
Wait,
It's like, I don't know.
So you
but
just won't
God.
answer the question.
Wait,
Okay.
but is God
No, I'm answering
just
the
a
question. It's just
thing,
like you look.
or
if
is
you,
God
if you
what
ask
he
me,
wants
say,
to be?
Look, God is himself necessarily. That's what it is.
Is himself what he wants it to be?
Well, yes, but only in the sense that it is himself that he's wanting to be. Like all he
So
can.
he
Saying God
is
doesn't say be good, he just won't say it.
So
That's all
he
he's
is
saying, right?
choosing what is good at that point. Like he is what he wants, if he is what his will wills himself to be, then he is also choosing what is good. No.
Yeah, but it's still going to be constrained to the same logic of rationality that he posed for humans as well earlier.
Yeah, it's just like mortal logic, right? Like even if you put this in any possible world you want, right? It doesn't matter. It will always come out the same, because what you're saying is this is mere logical relation. Once you start talking about this breaking down, it becomes incoherent. Not
Yeah,
just
but
to humans,
so is
it
being
becomes
like
incoherent.
the
Then why didn't you just say we can't know?
It's not that we can't know. It's that it's
he's saying the
actually, it
question
doesn't make
is flawed.
sense. It's
Like
incoherent.
yeah, like God is incoherent. Like God is, being Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end, like all of these things, like that. All
Being
of that
eternal.
is incoherent.
Wait,
yeah, like
Do you
Wait,
think that
why
like God is
believe
solved?
any of those things?
incoherent? What's the?
How do you
what
Do you
think
think
that-
that God is solved? Do you think that God is like solved?
I think the only person that could. What do you mean solve God? I mean,
Do you
mean
think we
like,
God
know
is solved?
everything? Do you think we know everything there is to know about God?
Of course not. We don't even know everything that there is to know about us,
So then why couldn't you just say we can't know?
because we're talking about
Because-
logic. Like this is transcendental. This is the foundation.
Okay,
of
but
thought
this
itself.
is your logic. This is human logic, not God
No,
logic.
I was just asking what you think. I'm not
it's-
taking
You
you.
go down the same line of reasoning with things like physics as well. Like
Yeah.
we do this all the time.
I
like,
have a different question.
No. Can I just say that? No, it's like ridiculous. Like, look, you can't just say like this is human logic. This is logic. Like, what you're saying is like there is
So
an
you're saying
identity.
you know that
of-
it can't be the case. You're saying I
Yes,
know that this
yes.
question.
Like
Okay, so
this is
okay.
incoherent. I know that this is
Okay.
incoherent. It is a
Okay,
contradiction.
so God
Like,
can't be known, but you do know that this question about God is incoherent. Okay.
Yes.
So okay, you won't answer yes or no because you know that God is this way.
I'm not answering yes or no because it's not a question.
It is
Like,
a
you don't-
question.
Perspective. I can
But
save
you know that it's not a question because you know that God is
because
this way. So
it's
stupid.
not, because it doesn't fit grammatically. Like it doesn't follow a linguistic syntax. It
Of course
it's
Yes,
not
it does.
okay. All right.
It is
Could
obviously
God make a
both
square?
grammatical
All right.
syntax.
Actually, could you
Could
draw
God
me
make a square circle? If God wanted to, yeah, probably.
No,
Yes.
I don't know.
oh my fucking.
Wait, of course,
Okay,
I
hold
don't
on.
know.
Okay.
God is beyond the human understanding. I don't know all of God.
If God can become
tomorrow
incarnate,
wanted to
No,
say
no, no,
God
no,
can
no, no,
evil
no,
is
no.
good,
if God,
and good is
if
evil,
I never
God can
said that.
become
he can do whatever he wants.
if God can become
I never-
incarnate and be born of virgin birth, I'm sure he can make a square circle.
One, right? Like in terms of well, we could
God
get
could
into the
just
allegory
change
of the
dimension.
scripture, right? Like what you're talking
Right?
about is operating in terms of a different form
Do you
of
think
geometry.
God is bigger than Euclidean geometry, or is he subject to Euclidean
You-
geometry?
Euclidean geometry is just one form of like yes, of course you could go, oh well, what I mean is something entirely different that's not actually captured by this definition. Like fair
You
enough.
just change everything. You could just like make monkeys poop gold. You could just change anything, right? You could just change chemistry.
You can't just change logical relation though. That's the whole point. Like if you're
So you're
defining
saying
two,
he's
We are
subject to
his
logic
creation.
then?
Yes, you can.
it doesn't. Yeah,
We
no,
are
no,
his creation.
you're misunderstanding, right? If you're posing a negative and a positive as contraries, and you're saying that they are necessarily contrary, as in one is the negation of the other, or you are basically saying that something could be itself and not itself simultaneously, or not be itself and or be itself simultaneously. Like, you're breaking the law of non-contradiction.
But God is those things. Like, do you believe in the
this is
Trinity?
so pedantic.
Do you like God
It's not
is?
pedantic, it's just common
Yes,
sense.
you're just saying that the question doesn't make sense because you're refusing the semantics that everyone else is willing to use. That's what you're saying.
Wait,
you're saying,
perspective.
I
Just
reject
concede
those
so I can ask my
semantics.
question.
I reject those words. Those words aren't the way that I use these words, so I reject the question. And
Wait,
No,
it's
I
okay.
just
Just take the
think you
L
don't
so I
understand them.
can
Well,
ask the question. Okay.
Hold on, because I don't want to go off topic just yet. Like it sounds like you are saying that God is subject to like rationale, like he's subject to logic. He's subject
God
to
is
your.
logos. God is logos, right? Like it says that even in John chapter 1, right? Like God, like the logos was God. Like it is like actually in the Bible to say that God is logic. Logic is an integral part of God. It is the foundations of identity relations at the most basic level. Like, even when we talk, and it applies everywhere. Like if you start talking about logic not working at all, then it becomes an incoherent nonsense.
So yes, you do believe God is bound by certain laws and rules then.
Yeah, he is those laws and rules.
He thinks God equals good. Therefore, the question of can God be evil is inherently contradictory because he's using his personal language of God equals good. Therefore, the question can't apply because you're saying, can God be not God? And he's saying, of course, that's not true. That's what's happening. Yeah. He's just being semantically stupid.
It's not
and
semantic.
Not
It's not even semantic. As I said, one,
semantic.
this is the standard Catholic definition, and two, and it's even in the Bible.
So you're rejecting the definition,
just
which by definition is semantic. Unless you disagree with the definition is semantic.
It is literally semantic. It is literally semantic.
It depends on what you mean by. What do you mean by semantic? Actually, go on. What do you mean by semantic?
Oh my gosh.
No. Do you mean like as in like the literal definition of the word?
We say semantic. I mean what everyone else means when we say semantic.
I'm being deliberate. So you think I'm deliberately obscure? That I'm not accepting something.
I hope not. I don't know you. I don't know why you're doing it. It's just frustrating to have a conversation. Because I would like to. Hold on. Can I answer fully for you for a second? I would like to have a conversation with you because it sounds like you know a lot about Catholic theology, and that's interesting to me. And I would like to talk to you and ask you questions. But if you do semantic word games and like won't play ball, it's frustrating because it's like I don't want to get into these semantic arguments. I just want to like engage in like the ideas themselves rather than getting into like, well, can God just not be God? Well, just assume that I'm using good in a different way than you are, and then answer the question of what you think.
Well, one, like it's not basic semantics because what we're talking about is syntactic relation, right? If you're talking about something in its negation, if you're saying could he make good evil and evil good and swap them, if you just mean something other than what is actually like what do you even mean by good? Like in that situation, what do you mean by evil? Like, are they actually opposed to each other? Because when you say it, I'm thinking it's a relationship between two things which are necessary negations of each other. So if you're saying that could he swap them? So if you could swap them, it's like saying, all right, this thing is like not itself anymore. And I'm like, okay, well, if it's not itself anymore, I don't know what it is.
But that is what she's saying. That is what she's asking is, can God make himself not himself? Can he be something different than what he is currently? Is he capable of making those decisions, of choosing to
whatever he said is good is now evil?
He would always end up like, look at how that would work. Could God decide not to be himself? okay, he decides not to be himself, but he's already himself to decide that. So he would always be himself. You mean,
Yes,
could he
but,
change?
but that would change what is good then, right? Like that is the point.
Foodshop
Is that
like,
what
I
is
hate
good
Jesus,
would
I hate
change?
God, I hate all of your
I
religions.
just want to ask my question. I just want to ask a
All right,
question.
ask your questions. It's fundamentally it's like.
I feel like I'm in a fish in a shark tank. Okay, all right. So all right. Okay, so here's my thing, right? So if God knows, so if I was God, all right, and I knew everything that is about to happen to everybody in the world, right? And I knew who was going to hell or not, right? Like if I look at somebody and they're like, they have like a I am going to hell sign above them, right? Not necessarily, right? But right.
No, yeah, okay.
Yeah, but I don't know if I'm. Are you? And you say that God loves all people, right?
Yes.
Would knowing that they're gonna go to hell and then not doing anything about that, letting their quote unquote free will guide them to hell, be a sign of love?
Well,
It's a
I think that
just-
there's. Sorry. Should
Like
I?
for me, I'm
No,
uncomfortable
sorry,
with that. I guess I don't
get-
know. You know, like
No, I understand that. Like, and I think that's because of the way, like, the way that we frame it. Like, one, it's like God, when we say that, like, your free will is you, right? So if God took your free will away, you would go with it, right? Like, it's not like it is to be what you are. It is basically to define that you have freedom. But it's more than that as well, in the sense that God, one, is trying to save you, and what we mean by hell as Catholics, right? Like, so,
wait, how is he trying to save me if
So-
he knows I'm about to go to hell and I'm going to hell,
So-
but he doesn't do anything about it?
well, this is what I was just going to say. Like, what Catholics take hell to be, well, he does do everything about it. He tries to convince you not to do wrong and provides you reason and every means to not harm yourself. But what Catholics mean by hell in the first place, it's not necessarily like a place. It's a spiritual relation, right? It's Thomas Aquinas says hell is the frustration of the wicked will. So it is.
Wait, hell isn't a lake of fire?
Real quick,
No,
I gotta
it's
run
not.
to the
It's like-
restroom.
it's metaphor.
Sprouticus, don't say the N word. I'll be right back.
Yeah, it's a metaphor. It's allegory. So like when we look at the way hell actually functions, like Aquinas argues, it's the frustration of the wicked will. So it's that what you are is essentially like it's essentially when we say it's made in the image of God, it's essentially a rational agent, and you're choosing to be irrational. You're rejecting yourself, and so frustrating yourself. You're actually causing yourself suffering. And
so if you died and you went to the afterlife and you end up in hell, what state are you in? Like you're not in heaven, right? You're definitely not in heaven. So what is hell in that scenario?
there's a few different debates on this, whether hell is like a aspect of like non-existence, where it's just like non-existence. It's like because if God is rationality, right? If God is logic,
The
then
lake of fire.
that's just the Protestants.
But would
like
would even the lack of like going to heaven be like just like the fact that people are barred from going to heaven just seems like okay, it just seems like a kind of, you know, like who's not gonna end up in like the best place ever, right? Like
Well, remember,
don't
like
know.
the whole point is that basically you can be freed from hell, right? Like you can actually undo hell, like
You
like
can?
What?
yeah, like Jesus descends into hell, and remember, hell is like in eternity, it's in furnace or whatever.
Okay,
is,
so
is
1 second.
everlasting, so it's not
One second.
temporal in the
I
way
need
that
to,
we.
I need to question you on something real quick. So one, what you said hell is not the lake of fire. So I don't know what you'd make of Mark 9:43, where Jesus is literally quoted saying, "If thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter life maimed than having two hands and go into hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched."
Yeah, because what we're talking about is allegory. It's like only like dumb Christians read the Bible literally. It's
There's other
Nice.
verses. There's other verses we can talk about too.
we can talk about any verse you like, but we're going to talk about it in allegory and metaphor.
So
like
there's not a single part of the Bible that's literal.
I never said that. I mean, you can. There's arguably points in
Well,
which you
only
could
idiots
say it.
read the Bible literally.
Oh yeah, absolutely, literally, 100%. If you're a
Right?
fundamentalist, you should smack your head
I'm
off
not
the
a
wall.
fundamentalist, so I'm glad we
Yeah.
resolved that.
Wouldn't
But
it be
I
a sin for
wouldn't
them to kill
say.
themselves though?
I
Wait,
mean, like, I think
can I
all
try
of
to
this.
like
I think like the
translate
whole.
I'm,
this
I'm
a
just
little bit?
I'm trolling. Don't
Like,
take me seriously anymore.
I think I understand where you're coming from. What I guess what you're trying to say. I don't know if it's coming across well or if like it's really difficult to explain this, but like it seems like what you're saying is that like hell to you is like a logical conclusion of living dishonestly. That it's just something that you were bound to experience if you're living dishonestly.
Yeah, if you're doing the wrong thing, yeah, essentially, yeah. It's just that you're doing it to yourself. You're actually like you're willing against your own existence.
Yeah,
It
so
is.
So
not
it's
Yeah.
not
necessarily
it's not
something
a
that's done
physical.
to you as a
So
punishment,
it's
but
not a
something
physical
that's done to you as a
space.
conclusion to the logic of your actions.
Like, well, like, yeah,
that what you're
exactly. The logic. Yeah, exactly. And when we say a physical space, remember, like Christians are arguing that physicality is produced from form in the first place. So, like, you'll have like God produces matter ex nihilo. So, from the mind of God, you have a form or like a rational like identity, which then produces matter to embody form. Like when we talk about matter in the first place, we're just talking about that which embodies form. So it's like even if we put it in physical terms, it's the same thing for a Christian. It's like the
So would
physical
that
is
also
just
be? So would that also be heaven for you too, as well? Like heaven for you is less of a place and more of a concept.
heaven is to be one with God, which is literally to be one with logic itself, to be one with reason.
So in your opinion, hell and heaven are two different places still though. Like if you're in hell, you cannot be one with God.
He's saying it's
Place
like
is
a
a good
state of
way to
being.
put it, but like remember, like when using terms like space and time, it's
Right,
best not to
right, but
put.
I am still separating these two, you know? Like that's
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing is, I feel like, right, at least from my point of view, if I have somebody I loved a lot, like with all my heart, and this person ended up in hell, but I ended up one with God, and I don't know, that doesn't sit well with me. But
The
I
worries,
like if God doesn't.
so it
It's the idea of the Godhead.
essentially the worries of this world will not be. So essentially, once you get to heaven, you're not going to be concerned with who's in hell. You're not going to be concerned with who's not in heaven. You're not. That's not going to be any of your concern. You're
Well,
not
I
going to be
wouldn't-
concerned
I
about
Yeah,
any
like
of that.
Wait,
your
what?
ultimate sole
I don't-
purpose
I
is to
don't think-
return
What?
to God, right?
Yeah,
like that's
remember,
all
Wait, that's so
religions.
sad though. So whoever you love
That's
will
it.
no longer be relevant at all.
No, I think
Well,
that's a mistake.
Yeah, like it
it's
depends. So
moral.
like what you're hearing right now, food shops, is you're hearing like the most like fundamental like Protestant versus like Catholic interpretations on like biblical like analysis, for example. So like Sprouticus, I believe you're Protestant, correct?
I am.
Yeah. So
Yes.
what you're hearing is like Protestants believe in like a literal hell that's like burning and on fire and people get like yeeted into there. Whereas most Catholics, like you said, I don't want to speak for you, but like it's allegorical. And so the idea of like the heaven and hell being allegorical, it's like these things is like divination.
Yeah, it's like
that make sense?
imagine it's one without zero, right? Like so it's not that hell exists, but that it's just that hell just isn't. And that is like the resultant of not doing that which is good, which allows you to be.
Yeah, that's one way you can interpret it, or that you are the smallest fundamental point of existence willing against itself. So
yeah,
it's like
it's because like
negative
it's like
infinity.
the return to Godhead sort of thing, which is like kind of like that's like the deep esoteric, like our whole goal, like the whole reincarnation, go to heaven, that's where you're supposed to be, right? Like that is the way that, you know, if you're trying to draw the bridge between Protestants and Catholics or any any religion that has like some afterlife shit. Yeah, it's all like, you know, return to Godhead, or go back into the wheel and try again eventually.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Like so like as well, like I will say like God is concerned with whether you're going to come back to him. That's the whole point of salvation. So if you're one with God, you're not going to lose
God.
those people. Yeah, you're not going to lose those people. You are going to love them. Like it'll be unconditional love.
Yeah, but what about the
it's
people
like
who are
it's like
sent to
within
hell?
it's like the whole like statement of like all children of Israel return to Israel, right? Which is like if you're taking Israel just to be like a name of God in that sense, even
It'll be a different type of. It'll be a different type of love though, because like if you have a husband or you have a wife, once you go to
It's
heaven,
mortal shit. It's just mortal bullshit.
you don't have a husband or wife.
Yeah. It's not. It's not even that.
Kind
It's
of
just
love.
it's mortal.
It's perfect love. I mean, it'll be perfect love.
You're not going to be hungry.
So even
you wouldn't
the
be
people who
hungry in
go
the
to
future.
hell. So even the people who will go to hell will become conjoined with you in the future.
Like
Okay.
it is
No, not even that.
No?
All right, let me ask you this, Food Shops, real quick. What's your favorite food?
Curry and rice, I think.
Okay, do you eat
pots
it
of
when
curry
you
chicken.
Cool, great, whatever. Do you eat it when you're hungry?
When I have enough money.
Yeah, okay, so like you have enough money and you're hungry, you'll eat it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now imagine you never get hungry. Fucking inconceivable, all right? Because it's mortal. Hunger is a mortal.
So I'll never
suffering.
feel love?
no,
Well,
no,
you will feel
not-
love. It's a different
not-
type of love.
Not your
Like-
soul,
perfect
you.
love.
Your demon, you will. Your soul, you won't, though.
I don't know. All of this just makes religion feel very cold and cruel, but I don't know.
It's a perfected type of love. And in heaven there won't be any pains, there won't be any sorrows, there won't be any tears, there won't be all the negative things of this world are going to pass on.
Yeah, but the thing is that just feels like emotional blunting, you know? Like if you take like medication or something and you have the side effect of emotional blunting, like that's what you're describing. Like if you go to heaven, you have no longer any these emotions, or you don't feel anything or whatever, you feel nothing. And that
Everything's
just feels
perfect.
I would actually say it's the opposite, right? Like
I feel like that's imperfection, right? Because the lack of emotion and etc.
Imagine
just,
so wait,
I feel like
stop.
I can't be without it, you know what I mean?
Wait, so 1 second. Imagine the euphoria. So like the reason drugs are so addictive is the euphoria that it gives off. So the reason a lot of people are addicted to meth is because of the euphoria you receive from meth, right? So imagine that euphoria multiplied times 1,000 infinity, whatever you want to say. Imagine that euphoria multiplied. That is an idea of what you would feel being inside heaven, is that massive euphoria.
Wait, but I thought it was nothingness.
Okay.
No, like look at it like this, right? Like you know when he said like when you want food, like it's because you're hungry, and so like you basically you want to feel a satisfaction to a drive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're wanting a satisfaction to a drive, what is it that you're actually wanting from that? Like any of these drives, like any of them, like how would you characterize them?
Basically, love is a lie, is what he's saying.
Like what I'm actually saying is that the only thing that you truly want is for the world to be a certain way. You want everything, your identity to be sustained in a certain way. If it was perfect, then
I don't know,
it would be exactly what you wanted. Like what we're talking about in terms of Christianity is not that you don't get what you want, but you get everything and more than you could have ever wanted.
Have you guys ever watched Star Trek Generations, the movie?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Okay, yes. So in the Nexus, that is the direct representation of heaven in the movie, right? Like it's a pretty one-to-one, whatever. In it, everything is fake, but I mean, it depends on what your definition of fake is, right? Everything you imagined that you wanted could be manifested for you, and it would be real for you. But at the same time, depending on what your definition of real or fake is, everything in the Nexus could also be fake, right? So what it feels like to me, at least, is that if you get to heaven, you are forced to be very content. You're forced to be feeling satisfied all the time, even though if you weren't in heaven, you wouldn't be feeling satisfied if you were still having your earthly desires, that you want your lover, you want good food, you want good friends, you want good whatever. But when you're in heaven, suddenly you are no longer having these earthly desires. That truly makes what you are as a person, your personality, it just doesn't feel right.
Have you ever heard a guy say to his partner, or a woman say to her partner, "You'll want for nothing"? Have you ever heard that phrase said? Okay. Do you know what that phrase means?
No.
Dude,
Okay.
we're all bored here.
Essentially, you'll want for nothing means that I have this massive amount of money, and whatever you want is yours. You'll want for nothing because it's all going to be yours.
Okay. Wait,
The
yeah,
idea
but
is
you
in
can't.
heaven,
Yeah.
in heaven, you'll want for nothing.
Yeah, the idea is that
Oh,
you do
yeah,
feel,
but-
you do
yeah.
feel. It's not like you're being satisfied against your will. It's that whatever you're willing is being. It's like it's not like. And I think the way that you're looking at it, and I actually I like the Star Trek reference, by the way.
Thank
Is
you.
is that it's kind of like Robert Nozick's experience machine. Like there is reality, and then there is this experience, which is pure bliss, but it's separate from reality. Like what God is to Christians is essentially integral to what is real. So what we're talking about is absolute truth, absolute goodness, and absolute beauty as a single unified state of being. That's
Right,
the state that you would be in, and it's
right,
called
I
like
know what
unification.
I know what you're saying, right? You're talking about like that, right? But the thing is, like, if I go to heaven, I can feel like I am wanted. I can feel like I am loved. I can feel all of these things. I feel like my partner is there. Like I can feel like my partner is there, but my partner isn't actually there. And the fact that my partner isn't actually there like makes me sad. Does that make sense? Like the fact that my partner isn't actually there makes me sad. Like sure, I wouldn't be sad in heaven because I'm in heaven, right? But at the same time, there is something fundamentally, I guess, missing.
Yeah, but I think
you're thinking,
the
you're
true
thinking about
person
it from
is
an
not there.
earthly.
Wait a minute.
I
think
think
about it
we've
from an
gotten a
earthly-
little
Can I
too
just quickly,
esoteric
just
here.
Remember
the-
that. Why wouldn't your partner be there? Just like,
Or we're done being
my-
esoteric. I have
They
something.
wouldn't be there because they're in hell.
Oh,
It's
why are
well,
they
not,
in
yeah,
hell?
it's
Hold
no,
on,
but
hold
why
on, hold on.
esoteric?
The point
Like,
is
I
that like
think-
we're talking about like a place that is meant to be perfect, and we're obviously going to have trouble
Well,
conceptualizing
no, that's like
that.
that's your
So
Yeah,
Protestant
but the
like
fact of
idea.
that is
There
that it's
is
not
no
perfect
I.
because
talking
the
about- he's not
true
talking about a
self cannot be
place
there.
either.
So it's
Like-
not perfect because you
It's
can't
not.
have
It's
everything
perfect.
you want.
Look, the real
No,
base take
there's
is
no I.
no, you don't want
Yeah.
anything.
Hey.
There's not like
The
yes,
base
there's
take-
not
You'll
a
want
thing
for
that you
nothing.
want.
Hold on. The base
It's-
take is that divination is cringe. We can't really know these things. Only God actually knows who's going where, and the rest of us probably shouldn't worry about it too much and just try to get yourself right with God if that's what you believe in, okay? That's the real thing. Who gives a fuck about divination for the most part? We're not doing apologetics.
Okay, kid not
I
kin.
mean,
Actually,
somewhat.
I
To
am,
be-
but
somewhat
it's
to be
not.
fair, but I think that I was just going to say I think
Nope.
that the reason that she's concerned though is to say that it's to say like, look, there's a situation where she might be forever separated from someone that she cares and loves about, and like I think the point of what we're trying to say really is to say that like that's something that God would care about too, and nobody would want that for anyone. So it's like I don't want you to feel like
Sure.
you're
So rather than giving
you're-
like an apologetics like nothing answer, just be like, you know what? That's a really valid concern. And one of the issues with any divination is that like we can't truly know as humans the answer to this. I think if you were a Christian and that was something you wanted to engage in, this is a question you should directly bring to God and try to wrestle with him. Because at the end of the day, that's where you're going to find the best answers, is doing your best to honestly and genuinely engage with God on the questions that are like weighing on your heart because God cares about them. And the reality is that none of us can truly know. We can just give you like our own thoughts, but you have to figure it out between
Well,
you and your
and
relationship.
especially
Do
for
you mean-
somebody
I think
who's
that's-
this is the
wait,
first. Hold on,
wait.
wait. No, hold on. Especially when this is somebody's first time engaging in any sort of like questions about religion and apologetics and all of this stuff. Like these are questions that are like downstream with of like 100 other questions that haven't been answered yet and that they haven't even thought to ask yet. And so they're asking like very hard questions that require so much other knowledge first that we can't possibly provide here on this panel. So I do want to go to KidNotKin, but Rezzy, go ahead.
Yeah, real quick. Do you mean faith, not divination, Erudite? Because it sounds like you're talking about faith, and I think there is a separation between the two.
There is, I guess I would need to ask
Okay.
you what you mean by divination specifically.
Divination, probably like the shit that's like outlawed.
I'll just
and,
use
like,
whatever you want to label it as. I
like
just
it,
wanna
like
make sure I'm
augur,
understanding.
like divination to me is like auguries, like sorcery. I guess would be like another way to put it.
Like magic.
Yeah, kind of, but like sorcery, like it's outlawed in like fucking the Burgess of Worms in like 1808 or some shit like that, right? That's like when magic gets outlawed in Christianity, and then like it's prosecuted later, right? So like hundreds of years later. But regardless, like it's so when you're talking about this, I think like you're talking about it through the idea of faith, not divination, because divination is like ritual practice that then goes ahead and brings you to some sort of God form stance, sort of, which I think esoteric practice, like Catholicism has a lot of esoteric practice. Everybody does. That's what prayer is and shit. Right. But like its
Right.
divination goes, I think, a little bit further than like just basic ritual
But
practice, which I think is more
divination was
faith-based.
just something like eternal that we couldn't possibly understand.
No, I think he's right. I think divination implies
divination-
that the individual acquires the knowledge for themselves, where faith is essentially asking God for assistance through revelation. At best.
Miracle. Miracle could be like establishing a miracle could be like another way to term it, I guess. But I don't know. I don't think that just I was just not unsure on your terminology.
Faith is compatible. I would say. I mean, like this is probably where me and the Protestants are going to disagree. But like faith is compatible with reason. Divination isn't. Divination's like essentially like you sort of leave essentially logical relations and sort of take the knowledge from the warp.
Yes. Yeah. It's you're trying to gauge unreason, right? Like versus reason.
Yeah.
Because unreason and reason, like they give definition to one another.
Sure. So all I might have used the wrong word, was I am trying to describe things concerning the understanding of God, right? So things about the understanding of God are going to be things that like we can't as humans really know. So that's going to be things like the magic of salvation and like who goes where and like all that sort of stuff, angel shit, all that I'm like kind of lumping together. So maybe divinity is a better word. I'm not sure but that's all I'm saying. I'm saying
that's how I would use divination as well.
I also real quick, just because I think this would be useful for food shops. How many of you that have faith in this think that there is a separation from you and God? Like I said, there is no I. I think that's like part of like where food shops is missing what you guys are describing religion as.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think if we mean the same thing, I think that I would probably.
Yeah, I think you and we're on different levels, but like I think you and I have similar concepts there. I mean more to Erudite and Sprouticus.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because you understand Godhead, but it's Erudite and Sprouticus. Is there an I? Like, do you remain an individual in the passing?
Is your soul an individual?
Wait, sorry. When you go to heaven, or
yeah. Do you remain an individual? Like, or are you just
So I'm the worst. I don't give a fuck about heaven. I don't care at all. I don't think about it. I don't even care if it's real. I don't care if it's all allegorical. I literally never think about it because it's so inconsequential to me. Because it's like it feels unfalsifiable. So I just don't care. So I don't know. I guess I'd have to think about. I'd need to look theologically. To be honest, I know I'm giving the worst answer, but I would need to go and like look through what scholars.
Wait, do you want to? Do you want to become one with God, or do you want to remain your individual self?
Whatever God says is good is what I want to do.
I see. I guess for another Star Trek reference, it's like the Borg, I guess. They are a hive mind. And it turns out that when a drone is separated from the Borg, even though they gain some of their individuality back, they miss being one with the Borg because there is a kind of lack of loneliness there of being one with the hive mind. But however, before you are one with the Borg, you really don't want to be one with the Borg because you really value your individuality. So I don't know,
Yeah, like, so I think that there's I think that if we look at like Eastern religions, this is like really similar to a lot of the shit that comes out of like the Upanishads, right? Where I might be actually Vedic text, I think, really, where it's like the idea that like you are God in like certain ways, but you're just a splinter. You go through this thing called the Wheel of Samsara, then you come back to it. You sort of are an individual, but like you're not. You're just a replicant experience of like the God form that exists, and that kind of would be a way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah. So to answer your question, food shops, just super quickly, because I'm going to head off. Basically, what I'd say is if I really trust God. So like I'm at the point in my faith where I think God is good. I trust him. I love him. And I think that any decision that he makes on my behalf is going to be good, whatever that happens to be. So if God says that in heaven, I stops existing and you become a Borg, I'm going to assume that I'm going to have a fucking great time. It's going to be dope as fuck. And I'm not going to worry about it. And it's going to be the right choice. But I don't really care about weighing in now about it. I think it's like, it's almost as pointless about weighing in about non-Christians and their sin. It's just like such a meaningless kind of thought experiment for me, I guess.
Yeah,
Okay.
can I ask the thing before
Yeah,
we
go ahead.
move forward? So
To me, or
first
should
I want to recognize that like this is incredibly complicated, especially for people that aren't trained in philosophy, and communicating these sorts of things to an audience no less is very, very difficult, and it's also kind of annoying for a lot of people, and I recognize that. But the thing that I'm personally interested in is it seems like from what I understand of what you're doing, it seems like you're sort of making like a Spinozist move, where like there's both a rational logic to like evolution, the human experience of being, etc., and there's a rational, and like trying to pair this with like a rational means to conclude that this is because of the logic of God, outside of just saying that it's the process of logic itself. Like my issue would be is if like the intentionality of God in this instance is, or the existence of God is non-falsifiable, and that the logic of his intention is basically just aligned with the logic of reason.
Sorry, is this directed
This
at
is for
me?
perspective
Or...
philosophy.
Oh, right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean,
okay, that's what
sorry,
I was like.
no.
I don't know. I'm gonna dip then, guys. I'm
I
just
would
gonna
not
head out.
use this
Sorry.
language.
All right,
if
Thanks,
anyone-
Kyle.
I did think so. I was like,
No.
you've lost me already. Okay. Have a good one. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Bye.
See you.
Excuse me. Yeah, essentially, I would actually reject Spinoza. One, I would say that I think Spinoza
Spinoza,
makes,
it's all like absolute affirmation and stuff. I
yeah,
understand.
but
you're
it's the
Hegelian,
absolute
right?
substance, right? Like, so like the
Right,
difference
yeah.
between the difference between me and Spinoza is that Spinoza is more of like Hegel describes Spinoza as was it a cosmist? So it's like there is this where like God is this sort of unity of being, but it's this abstract simplicity that represents, that's something similar to a kind of sort of brute reality, right? Like where the Aristotelian conception of God, or like really I would say like the Trinitarian conception of God, places God in a relationship, in a dialectical relationship with himself, so that there is that there is aspects to God which necessarily interlink and cannot be ontically replaced. So like there is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit, and each have specific relations to the way that the universe functions, and in such a way as that like this is where like Hegel would call it the absolute syllogism, where it's like if God the Father's existence, God the Son is truth, and God the Spirit is love, then we have essentially they have God loving himself or making himself for all of eternity through a dialectical relationship, through a dialogical relationship. I think that's the main difference. So like, does that answer your question or not, or do you want something more specific?
No, not precisely. No.
Okay.
So let me try and phrase it a little bit differently. As you've been describing God as beholden to the to logic and rationality, because of that is the way that the world works, and that it must necessarily work in this way, like this, that there is a logic to it. I don't understand how in the same problem that I would have for like Spinoza claiming substance as God, to the degree that as far as my readings of Spinoza, he kind of distances himself a little bit in regards to freely redefining his nature outside of God. The problem that I do have is that there seems to be a particular step in like in this same way as like Spinoza made this conclusion, where like we just because we have a logical process and because we have reason, that following this back to the logic of the universe, we can just proclaim that there must necessarily be a God for this to. It seems tautological. once it gets back to that point. And I
Right.
can't see how like this is actually escaping that problem.
Yeah, I think like the way that I was trying to sort of relate this is basically that when God, essentially in the Spinozian sort of sense, God is this he's this being which is one with himself, but it's like this
Right.
you sort of reason back to God, and God isn't like there's no there's no motivational necessity to reason to this. So it just seems it's esoteric. And I think that's the issue that you're having. It just seems that we're defining God as existence, and then once you do that, then of course God is existence, and it's tautological.
Well, yeah, exactly. And then when you go from that
Yeah.
point to then also start explaining about like the intentions and rationality of God outside of just this linear logic, then it seems like you're almost like breaking away from the logic that propped up God in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a problem. I think that's a real problem for Spinoza. But what I would want to respond with, and this is where like the Hegel makes the argument. Essentially, logic requires a teleological element in itself.
Right.
So it's like
I'm
the
working on my
activity.
Hegel.
No, it's okay. It's so there is the activity of thinking, and
Mhm.
in the activity of thinking, you have an end goal, which is actually obtaining yourself. And so when we look at it like this is why when I said God the Father's existence, that's what Spinoza's talking about. It's very similar to like the Judaic God, like sort of Islamic God, and it's like and it's almost like a like innate cosmism, right? Where it's just this brute existence. But when we talk about like the Son or like truth, we're
Okay,
talking
but
about
before we get into
a
this part,
positive
before we get
essence.
into this, so like this seems more so that it's tying back to not just the nature of logic itself, but the implication that there is necessarily free will, and that the existence of free will is what gives logic to the God that you're speaking of now.
I would say it's reason, or I would or say nous specifically. So it's like that's the way I would respond to it. So like think of it like this. It is logic itself. It is reason itself that we are talking about.
Yeah, I know that's my
And
problem. Yeah.
yeah, but if we're talking about it being reason itself, then it is the like to deny its existence is essentially to deny the capacity of rationality as a whole and end up in absurdism, right? So it's like there isn't like something you can do about it. It's necessity.
Right, and well, I mean, I would agree, but I don't see that it's a necessity um, to then prop up God as the reasoning behind this.
Well, the way I would argue for it, I think that you can't do it unless you make a metaphysical argument. And I
Right,
think the
yeah.
metaphysical argument that I would make would be essentially that I would argue for one, an idealism. I would say that idealism is the only coherent metaphysic, specifically that of objective idealism, which implies that reality is itself fundamentally a mind. So if we're talking about the unity of existence necessarily with itself, and existence is mind, I mean, that's the divine mind of God, right? So it just depends on where we are metaphysically.
Right. Okay. I see where you're coming from, but I also have to recognize that like this could very, very easily spiral into a conversation, which is going to leave everyone bored out of their fucking mind. But I'd love to talk to you about it more in the future.
Too late.
I would like that too.
Just kidding.
Yeah, right.
And
we've been in that ground for a while, okay? That's why I felt like I had the ability to have this conversation in the first place. But also, I know it's your show, so like.
No, I'm actually I've got nothing else really to add, and I was gonna shut it down fairly soon. So, yeah, if
Can I just
anybody
quickly
else
just
has
say something
anything to
to
say, yeah.
Rez?
Yeah, go ahead, buddy.
Yeah. So like, I was just gonna say like when we're talking about like the relationship before to God being essentially where the self doesn't exist in relation to the Godhead, I would push back on that. I would say all there is the self, and that when we talk about, and this is where like where I think unlike the Eastern religions, it would be inverted, where they want to reject individuality. I think that individuality is the unity of existence. So like if we're talking about like you don't exist anymore, it's like no, you exist perfectly as you are, which is one with God. And I think that would be the difference. Now that's sort of in some Eastern religions. So some forms of Hinduism actually argue for that, and that's like para-Brahman, where it's like the sort of unity of the Atman with para-Brahman, but it's not like it's Brahman and Atman become para-Brahman, which is the unity of the self and as a particular and the universal simultaneously. That's more what I would be arguing for.
So, but like, are you saying that you're at the universal, but you're just not with the universal? Like as you.
You are you, and with God
Uh-huh.
simultaneously. So look at it like 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 have you ever read Plato's Phaedrus?
No, not at
So
all.
it's like a poem. So like it's
Okay.
a poem, and at the end of the poem, he talks about seeing all these like spheres and stuff, which is the world of forms. And at the end of the poem, he talks about seeing the formless, intangible essence, which is the form of the good, right?
Yeah.
But he's the one perceiving it. It's like you're the thing which has caused all of being to see itself, seeing itself as itself.
Well, yeah. So then, like, yeah. So you are God is effectively like
You
the
are
kind of
you are God.
Yeah, that's
and
just
not
like that's
God.
that's the reduction and the way I would put it, I guess, personally. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're one with
Okay.
God in spirit,
Yeah.
anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think then like
Uh,
I kind of see exactly what you're saying.
I do have to head out though. So I'm gonna go ahead and shout out my shit. It's KidNotKin on all the platforms. Literally all of them. Listen, really, really esoteric conversation, but I love having them personally. If anybody wants to hit me up and have these conversations outside of stream or on stream at some other point, totally free to hit me up.
Okay.
Every single one of you. I love you. Have a good night.
Thank you, sir.
Good night.
And then, yeah, we'll
Be
give
well.
everybody else a chance to shout yourselves out real quick. If Rezzy, you want to go next.
Yeah, real quick, I want to your chat knows me well enough. To that person that was
And you guys can give
chat,
like a closing statement as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
I got you. Yeah, so to that person in chat that said that they didn't like the tone that I said something with, go fuck yourself. Literally go fuck yourself with a rake. I'm Rezzivaer on all platforms. Some of you know me, some of you don't. But you'll feel free to talk to me. As long as you don't tone police me, go fuck yourself, whoever the fuck you were.
Yeah. All right. Food shops.
Yeah, I'm kick.com
You're
/food
kick.com?
shops. No, I'm not. No, I'm okay. Keep your mustache on, okay? Kick.com /food shops. YouTube is at a food shops. And well, I let anybody on to talk to me whenever. There's not like a main event. I still do that to this day. So yeah, it doesn't matter how big I get, I let anybody on. So yeah, that's about it. I'll see you guys on the flip side. Okay.
Cool.
Farewell. Goodbye. All right.
And then Sprouticus.
I am the Sprouticus. Can we? I mean, are we allowed to do self promo in the address here?
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. I'm the Sprouticus. You can find me at twitch.tv/thesprouticus and x.com, twitter.com, whatever you want to call it, at the Sprouticus. Soon to be YouTube at the Sprouticus. I am getting ready to start a podcast. I know I've been saying it for forever, but I'm actually getting the logo ready and getting everything ready for it. Of Medicinal Masculinity, or the MedMask podcast. So looking forward to starting that, where we're gonna have conversations about men's health and men's mental health awareness, and basically stuff that's affecting men in society. It's gonna be fun.
Cool. All right. Appreciate it. And then Perspective Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks again for having us on. Like, obviously, I know I just jumped in towards the end, and I didn't mean to hijack things too much. I know
No, it's good.
I'm quite verbose, you know. But yeah, like, thank you for watching, and I hope everyone had a good time. I hope you could understand some of what I said. I'm a sort of philosophy student, if you will, and yeah, you could find me at Perspective Philosophy and on YouTube. So yeah, but thank you again, man. Really appreciate it.
Base man. Yeah, appreciate you jumping on. I'm glad you were able to. Hope you feel better. I know you're not feeling great, but hope you feel better. And I appreciate y'all coming. I'll hopefully do this again soon, and I'll hit you guys up.
Yeah, it'd be nice to do this weekly.
I do a so normally I do like a scheduled panel where we have like the topic scheduled. You came on it last time with the that's the shootout. And then the day before, we do the super chill fun time panel, which is just like a pop-on panel where I'll just send out invites to random content creators and just, hey, we're going live at this time, we'll end at this time, so just hop on whenever. And then we just kind of get into whatever comes up. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Cool, guys. Have a good night.
Bye.
You too.
Later. Oh, those people. Oh my goodness. What's up, guys?